Hello humans, accelerationists, Qualia formalists, Valence engineers, and hedonistic imperators, and welcome to the Cosmic Tortoise podcast. This podcast is an absolute doozy. It features a guy called Gomez Emilsson, who is a half Swedish, half Mexican consciousness researcher. He runs the blog Qualia Computing and is a member of the Qualia Research Institute. I'm joined by my friend James Ormrod, who some of you may remember from some previous podcasts. James actually introduced me to Qualia Computing sometime last year, and the website is an absolute trip. In this conversation, we introduce you to Qualia Computing and its principal goals and ideas. We talk about philosophy, consciousness technologies, psychedelics, valence engineering, which is essentially happiness engineering, the ideas of David Pearce and the hedonistic imperative, ethics, technology, a bunch of stuff. We really cover a lot in this conversation. It can get a little bit lofty later on in the conversation, so if it's getting into too much high geometry and mathematics and programming language, feel free to skip forward a bit, and it does slightly return to at least orbit later on. I won't say any more, I'll let the conversation speak for itself, but let's just say Qualia Computing is an absolute trip, and it was an absolute pleasure to have Andres on the podcast. I think you guys will really enjoy this one. So firstly, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself, what started this all, and how you became interested in consciousness and psychedelics?
Well, yes, I was born in Mexico. I lived in Mexico until I was 16. And then I went to Norway and then California to study. And I've been in the States for almost 9 years now. And I really kind of was super interested in figuring out the nature of reality, I think from a pretty early age. But most of my approach was on kind of having a physical or mathematical account of it. And I read some philosophy when I was a kid, but really kind of I thought all of the answers were going to be in physics, for all the important questions. And it really wasn't until I was 16 that I really had some very peculiar experiences back then. When you're young and foolish and you try something like pot. And for some reason I had a very idiosyncratic reaction to it. I mean, most people don't have a kind of ego death type experiences to marijuana, but for some reason in one particular occasion I had a really profound experience that made me reconsider kind of the big picture understanding of what is fundamental in reality. And it made me think a lot about personal identity and a lot about consciousness, and I kind of shifted my focus from just focusing on physics and mathematics into consciousness being the most important question. It definitely was a very important trigger. And in particular, I think my biggest focus at the time really became personal identity, which is the question of basically, who are you? Do you continue to be the same person from moment to moment? And in what sense is kind of the observer of consciousness different from one person to another? And I explore a lot of those views, really thinking they might help in grounding ethics from a rational point of view. And then later on, I became interested in transhumanism, largely thanks to reading David Pearce, who, for those who don't know, is a British philosopher who focuses on reducing suffering with biotechnology. And ever since, I think my sophomore year of college, my focus has really been on figuring out how to reduce suffering with consciousness technologies. So, okay, that's a very kind of big picture account of everything that's been going on.
That's great. There's a couple of questions just related to that. I don't know if you'd mind sharing or not, but I wonder what kind of experience you had the first time, or one of those first times that you tried smoking weed, and what the dose was.
Oh, sure. Well, dose I really couldn't tell you. My guess it wasn't very much. Probably a joint or two between two persons. So probably half a joint or one joint or something to that extent. I just think I was very sensitive to it at the time, at least. But yeah, I think like the overall quality to it was that I experienced my reality to actually be fundamentally made of something that doesn't have a taste or a shape or anything I would otherwise associate with an individual person. So kind of like the vision I had was something along the lines of like an infinite orange sea of consciousness. And orange was like very metaphorical, but it kind of symbolized this sense of consciousness. And I was a little box within that big sea. And then I realized that I usually think that I am the sea that is inside the box. But I realized that the very nature of it was exactly the same inside of the box and outside of the box. And the box was really very much of an artificial container. It really actually didn't produce a different identity. Then my brain also represented my friend as also like a box with the same orange sea inside of him. And really feeling that, well, we, like, I kind of like stopped identifying with my particular box and identified with the sea in general. And that experience, I mean, it was for some reason extremely powerful and really tied together a lot of the questions that I had been thinking about personal identity for several years at the time.
So before that, had you been exposed to what you would, I guess, later refer to as open individualism or those kinds of descriptions of modes of existence? Had you been exposed to those ideas already?
I had not, which I actually thought at the time that maybe I was one of the first persons to think of that possibility, which is definitely not true. I mean, it's been going on for thousands of years, people hypothesizing about it. But I mean, I had been exposed to some Western philosophy. In particular, I had read basically like Greeks as well as like 17th, 18th century European philosophers. But yeah, none of them, to my knowledge, really kind of addressed open individualism, which, yeah, for those who haven't heard of it, it's basically the view that there's only one consciousness, and that's everybody.
I think we might try to discuss those in some detail a bit later on, the modes of personal identity that are sort of systematized these days.
Sure, definitely.
So, moving on from that experience, you mentioned that you then got into David Pearce. How did that happen?
Yes, so the full story is I stumbled upon his writings, I think, when I was 16, studying in Norway, and after the experience. And one of the things that kind of like really stuck with me was a little bit that he had, I think, like at the very bottom of one of his writings, probably like mdma.net or something like that, which basically he said something like, right now, utilizing substances or treatments to basically feel really good seems like necessary. But then he speculated about how in the future, actually taking any sort of drug would probably be diminishing your well-being because you're already optimized for the maximum well-being, which really made me ponder, like kind of like that view that, hey, like you are by default already perfectly constructed for your own well-being, that taking any substance will simply diminish it. But I for some reason like didn't kind of like focus particularly on his writings. When I actually came across him again was during sophomore year of college, which is also the time I co-founded the Stanford Transhumanist Association with a friend of mine, Faust Well. And when I was managing that group, I actually started using Facebook for the purpose of finding out other transhumanists and organizing events. And he actually happened to be on Facebook and be very active on Facebook, a very vibrant community, the hedonistic imperative. And basically I asked him whether he was interested in giving a talk at Stanford. And since that moment, I really got a lot more into his writings and discussing with him about, obviously futurism but more specifically consciousness. I mean, I definitely attribute a very big part of the way in which I approach studying consciousness to my conversations with David Pearce. He definitely changed my mind in some very specific ways that definitely influenced how I think about it nowadays. And it really was, I think, the understanding that, hey, like this kind of like view that maybe you can spread around the notion that we are all one consciousness. Sure, people might be more kind to each other, but the hedonic treadmill will still be an issue. And that's something that I really hadn't grokked before, I think, talking with David Pearce, kind of this idealistic sense that, well, if everybody acted ethically and everybody was, trying to help each other, everything would be fine. But the truth is that there would still be depression and anxiety and angst and so on. So like my focus then actually shifted into figuring out how to improve the quality of our state of consciousness, rather than just philosophizing or changing one's view about philosophy.
And this is what David Pearce has written quite extensively about, the limitations in our biology, how we're subject to so many regulatory set points in terms of our hedonic tone and other things that will really prevent us from achieving those kinds of things within our current unmodified biology.
Yes. That's right. He actually motivated me. He personally insisted after a while that I should publish my writings and actually share them and write more in public. I mean, definitely he's been a huge influence on pretty much how I see the the world and the future.
Is that what led you to start Qualia Computing?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I had thought of it, but then he really kind of pushed me over the edge into actually making it happen. One of the strange things that David Pearce has lots of very, very cool advice. I mean, he basically works his advice from first principles, just assuming that we are Darwinian creatures, and they tend to be pretty accurate, although sometimes may sound a little bit pessimistic. But he does say, like, it doesn't matter really what you do. If you really want to get something done, it'll happen. It's kind of in the context of like writing papers or making high production value videos about transhumanism or whatnot, it's less about, like actually being paid to do so and more about like actually just wanting to do it.
Sure thing. So we discovered you through your blog, Qualia Computing, or some people say Qualia, I think. Let's jump into that. So what are Qualia?
I mean, Qualia, it's definitely a word that is pointing at a whole range of phenomena. However, I would say at its very core, it really describes the way in which the different aspects of your experience feel like. Now, that sort of requires, in a sense, that there are like multiple aspects to your experience. I mean, like, it's not the case that a given moment of experience just contains, let's say, like one flavor. Usually, you have a wide variety of kind of aspects of your experience. You may describe, for example, the various colors in your visual field, the various textures, as well as the way in which sound feels, or the way in which taste experience reveals itself. And usually people tend to kind of like apply the word qualia just to these like very explicit sensory qualities. To a large extent, that's what we can talk the most about because they're correlated with states of the outside world, and we can reproduce them systematically. You can basically provide like the same frequencies of light in an equally illuminated room and produce like very similar experiences to the ones that you had yesterday and so on. But I also include other things within qualia, such as the way in which thought feels, or very subtle moods, for example, or even what I call ontological qualia, which is the way in which your theories about reality itself feel, which is very crazy that, if you only experience kind of the raw sensory qualities that we typically associate with a word, like colors and textures and sounds, but you didn't have like thought, or you didn't have ontological qualia, you wouldn't be a person, really. I mean, it's just like this assembly of kind of like uncommented qualia of color and sound. But yeah, I include within the definition of the word pretty much everything that has a way in which it feels. And that includes like very subtle or very hard to talk about aspects of one's experience.
So the difference here is you have this in your blog, propositional versus ontological qualia. And when we're talking about ontological qualia, we're talking about knowledge, or kind of inherent or deep knowledge of a worldview or a personal philosophy. Is that right?
Yeah.
And then by default, that will, of course, influence how you see and feel everything else that happens to you.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
To illustrate the point a little bit, you could have pretty much a very similar, let's say, like colors and textures and sounds, and a completely different ontological qualia. And the difference between two experiences that basically share the same low-level qualia, like colors and so on, but have different ontological qualia, or two experiences that have the same ontological qualia, but completely different colors and textures and sounds, I would say the first pair is a lot further apart. I mean, like really changing your ontological qualia transports you to a completely different reality with different grounding, different rules, different understanding for how time and space work. It's one of the things that kind of like point a little bit in that direction is definitely the phenomena of deep religious conversion. I mean, when a person has an experience that makes them become religious, independent of the religion, but usually there's a transformation in how they perceive the very nature of the world to be. And that causes a whole set of extreme changes to the interpretations of everything else, like just how everything else is connected changes completely, at least within how you model the world.
Suddenly, the warm light of the sun is now the light of God.
Definitely. Things like that, yes.
Yeah. Sure thing. All right, so we have the three main goals of qualia computing are to catalog the entire state space of consciousness, identify the computational properties of experience, and reverse engineer valence. So maybe we could tackle all those one at a time.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so
first one, cataloging the entire state space of consciousness.
Yes. So, it's the motivation here. Let's start off just from a raw scientific curiosity. What is the set of all possible experiences that exist, and what do they feel like? People. It really seems nowadays that naively, the range of human experience maybe spans a very large percentage of the experiences that you could have, whether it's like kayaking or skydiving or watching a movie. But everything that you consider within the range of normal human experience is just a tiny region in the state space of consciousness. To begin with, we also have other examples of conscious experiences, such as dogs, dolphins, elephants, just other animals. Probably the range of experiences that they have is very different than ours. And then, of course, we have people with damage to their brain in several ways, or people with various variants to their neurological organization, whether it's autism or Down syndrome. And of course, we have different states of consciousness unlocked by different substances, and in the future, probably a whole range of other methods, including optogenetics and changes to the proteins inside neurons, gene expression. So really, in what sense do we know what's possible in the range of experiences? I think we don't know practically anything about how big this space is, what exactly is found in it. But given what people report in terms of the value of some of the experiences that can be had, especially if you step a little bit outside of the range of human experiences, some people may come back and tell you, hey, there's ranges of experiences that really feel that are at an entirely different level of the quality of experience, that their intrinsic value is just superhuman in a sense. So even just beyond just scientific curiosity, we also have kind of some ethical or interesting opportunities as well. And of course, understanding deeply the structure and the range of negative experiences can help us prevent and reduce the badness of those experiences. Yeah, and maybe we can now kind of go to the second objective. Do you mind reading it again?
So the second goal is identify the computational properties of experience.
Right. So the core idea here really has to do with what consciousness is for. So why is it that we are conscious to begin with? For a lot of people, they may think of, well, consciousness is just the inevitable result of processing information. But it seems at least that consciousness has some properties that are still puzzling and definitely don't entirely consistent with that way of seeing it, which is consciousness, for example, contains an intrinsic quality to it. But more than that, it's also unitary in the sense that when you have a moment of experience that contains a lot of information simultaneously. And I think like one very promising theory for why is it that we are conscious rather than just unconscious automata is that the unity of consciousness plays a computational role. So that actually having a unified experience is doing some computational legwork that maybe could be done otherwise, but it would be a lot more expensive, either in terms of biological constraints or for fundamental deep down computational reasons that actually the unity of it provides some computational shortcuts not available without such unity. But in addition to that, I mean, you have to ask the question, like, why did evolution select the particular values of qualia that we have for the purposes that it uses them for? I mean, like, we definitely have the case of people with synesthesia who, may experience colors when they hear a sound, or they may taste when they see a color. And some people may ask, like, hey, like, why are we not all synesthetes? Like, what makes the quote-unquote normal way of seeing the world like the best one or most evolutionarily adaptive? I mean, my take on that is that we are all synesthetic. The only thing is that the particular kind of synesthesia that we have tends to be very evolutionarily useful. So, and there's going to be a reason for that. The fact that we use color qualia in order to represent visual stimuli, I don't think that's just a coincidence. I think that the range of possible colors and their combinations is a really good peak in terms of if you had a menu of possible qualia types to represent information, choosing color for representing visual stimuli, I think it's a really good choice in terms of actually how displaying and rendering and making information that matters salient and available. And the same for sound and even thought. I mean, like, presumably you could create a brain that thinks using color rather than with our very subtle qualia of thought. But I think like the qualia that we have is has been probably very, very well selected over millions of years for that purpose.
So you would be, say, implying that if the process of generating these qualia was, subject to evolutionary processes, for example, our visual qualia might be subject to forces that would cause them to be maximally discriminatory in how we see them. So we see a broad palette of colors, or the available range of colors on Earth are represented to us as being maximally differentiated.
Yeah, that's correct. Something to that effect. For the most part, focused on making salient basically things that increase the chances for you to reproduce. So the qualia that we may use for representing other people might actually have a lot of correlation with like things such as like potential compatibility or genetic fitness, and likewise, like the kind of qualia that we experience for sound is also optimized to be able to detect threats and opportunities for reproduction.
Or just in the case of the visual qualia, maximizing the distinctiveness of the representation would in some way, minimize the computational load, maximize the amount of information that can be passively gleaned from a unified experience.
Yeah, that's right. One definitely also has to be careful there's also too much ability to discriminate. So there's also a balance in the opposite side. I mean, there might be, I suspect, qualia that it's even better at representing vision, but it's just too energetically costly. Maybe it takes too many calories to implement and so on.
The last one we have here is reverse engineer valence, and perhaps we could first describe what valence is.
Yes, so valence is the pleasure-pain axis. And this word is usually used in the context of affective science, or affective psychology and neuroscience, in terms of describing the components of emotion. So emotion usually is described in terms of valence and arousal. So like arousal is the amount of energy that one experiences. during one emotion, whereas valence is how good it feels. So you can have, for example, high valence, high arousal states, which is kind of like excitement and anticipation. And you can have like high valence, low arousal states, like peacefulness and serenity. And likewise, negative states also have like their own valence and arousal, like depression and anxiety. They both suck, but they have like different levels of arousal. But I'm mostly interested in valence. I mean, like I think like the question of arousal and other dimensions are much more a personal preference. It's like, hey, do you like to be very active or more peaceful or more calm? I don't care. But as long as you're feeling happy or you're feeling good, that's what matters to me. So really, then the kind of like one of the just to be, I guess, like very explicit about this, I tend to associate myself a lot as a hedonistic utilitarian, in the sense that I think that the measure of what matters in terms of like value has to do with suffering, the less the better, and happiness or valence, high valence well-being, the more the better. So from that point of view, really understanding valence, I think, is extremely important from an ethical point of view, because it will allow us to basically reduce as much suffering as possible in a very efficient way and maximize well-being as well. That said, like most academics that I'm aware of don't tend to think kind of like or take seriously the possibility of like truly understanding valence, and they definitely don't realize the possible implications of it, or like how big of a deal it is. It definitely helps that we consider valence something that is actually possible to reverse engineer, and it's actually real, as opposed to what a lot of people end up actually thinking about valence, which is that it's really kind of arbitrary, that a person may like ice cream and another person may hate ice cream, so therefore there's no ground truth to whether an experience is good or bad. But from our point of view, if that is the case, actually what's going on is that ice cream triggers a high valence state in the first person, but it doesn't trigger a high valence state on the second. But that everybody actually likes high valence states, and they all share a given quality.
This brings us to the realm of philosophy. And before we dive into a bit more of your philosophy in depth, I thought we could just start with a few basic questions from your blog. So the first one here is, why is philosophy important?
Right. So, I mean, there's a quote by David Pearce I definitely use for thinking about why philosophy is important, which is that really not engaging with philosophy nowadays, at least for some scientists, is fashionable. It's kind of like, oh, philosophers will just endlessly discuss, let's actually just go to the world and measure things. But the counter to that is that not doing philosophy doesn't actually allow you to transcend it. All it does is give bad philosophical arguments a free pass. And the reason is that philosophical background assumptions show up all the time. I mean, it's very difficult to do any science whatsoever without having a very heavy philosophical framework, even though it's usually implicit and not visible, just working from the background. And but it's actually doing a lot of work in terms of how people focus their energies, how people pursue particular avenues of research and make hypotheses. So yeah, philosophical background assumptions are huge and they're unavoidable. So it's much better to actually just be explicit about them and investigate them, even if you're just doing quote unquote standard science. But yeah, I guess like yeah, that would summarize my response to that question.
Everybody's a philosopher at the end of the day, whether they know it or not.
Yes.
Or whether they admit to it or not.
Who do you think is ignoring philosophy to the most detriment in science today?
Right. Well, I mean, definitely in the field that I'm the closest to would be like neuroscience and computational neuroscience to kind of like focus on a particular region, which is they don't take the properties of consciousness very seriously, which is definitely something that you need a lot of philosophical focus to actually grasp. to understand like what is it that you should be taking seriously about consciousness, and what is it that you shouldn't. There's often kind of like a blanket ban on taking properties of consciousness too seriously, and instead just focusing on very, very simplified models of how the mind may actually work. I think like other regions where this happens for sure is like policy making. This is definitely not my area of expertise, but it's where it does definitely show up, which is on important questions such as when to interrupt an abortion, or like when is it actually ethical to do so? Because at the end of the day, whether abortions should be allowed or not, and at what point they shouldn't, really comes down to very deep philosophical questions like personal identity and at what point consciousness begins, or whether it even matters that consciousness is there as long as there isn't suffering, and so on. So it actually becomes extremely relevant for those kinds of questions. But we, at least societally, philosophy is not actually brought in an explicit way in that kind of discussion. There tends to be like other considerations that to me like are not as important.
I think what seems to be troubling me the most in terms of people who are ignoring philosophy is usually in political discourse for, talking about political decisions that affect the, lives and behavior of millions of people without a sufficiently good grounding in, say, population ethics or even just utilitarianism or morality in general.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So you've said that you think the purpose of life is to understand the universe and be happy and make others happy. How did you come to this view?
Right. Well, there's this kind of it gets to the core of the question of what makes a metaphysics, and I think there's kind of this idea that when we don't understand reality, we can't really trust our sense of what is valuable. And if we don't have a sense of something that's valuable, then what's the point of understanding reality? So I think they actually come hand in hand. In the end, I think if you force me to kind of just select one, yes, I think like just being happy is what matters. But for a wide variety of reasons, I think it's very helpful to encode as what matters is both understanding together with happiness and high valence. Because again, figuring out what actually is high valence will require a very good understanding of the universe. So that's why they go hand in hand.
On another post on your blog, I think this might even be the title, and it's the most important philosophical questions. First one here is, what is good and is there a ground truth about it?
Yes. So people's metaphysics are usually made of, a sense of one, what is real, and then second, what is valuable. I think in that particular post, one of the things I was highlighting is that your understanding of reality could be very different depending on how you interpret what valence is. And at least in my experience, and knowing a lot of people who are very deep into spirituality, I think there's definitely a very important consideration, which is interpreting valence as a spiritual phenomena versus interpreting spirituality as a valence phenomena. And I think like that really, changes your view of reality completely, whether you're in one, you take one of these views more seriously than the other. So basically taking valence as a spiritual trick is usually what religions and spiritual schools tend to do, which is whenever you feel really good, that usually indicates that you're getting closer to the truth, or you're getting closer to some ultimate value, or the absolute, or God, or whatever might be what matters in that religion. On the other hand, if you interpret basically spirituality as a valence trick, instead you think that, hey, like for evolutionary reasons, beliefs that makes us think that we are like safe in a very long term and that reality is really good will make us feel good. So yeah, for sure, if you have an interpretation of reality like that God will take care of you and so on, that might feel pretty good. So it's not a surprise then that spirituality basically triggers high valence so intensely as well. So But yeah, there are completely different interpretations of what would matter if one is the real or not. And I think at the end of the day, this question of like which one is the one that is tricking the other, I think like really divides a lot of how people believe reality is.
And this sort of ties us nicely into personal identity. We talked about open individualism earlier, which is this feeling that everything is one big consciousness and you're a part of it. We also have two other types, closed individualism and empty individualism. I thought we might better go through all three with some mainstream religious examples. So let's start with closed individualism.
Sure. So closed individualism is the kind of like the common sense view. And I mean, for evolutionary reasons, or at least for evolutionary reasons, we have a predisposition to just take it at face value. That is definitely the thing that I used to believe in implicitly for most of my life, which is that you start existing when you're born and you stop existing when you die. And it was what really was shattered, at least as the main hypothesis, when I had the very strange experience when I was 16 years old, that this notion is not necessarily completely well-founded. I mean, it's more of an assumption, or just like what it feels like, than something that most people have examined particularly closely. So intuitively, people feel that, well, you are your memories, or you are what has happened to you. Some people may even think that, there's a metaphysical soul that ties together all of the moments of experience within your life, and that is why you're the same person as you were yesterday. And some people may even ascribe this continuity just to causality. Like, hey, like your body, the state of your body nowadays, including your brain, is directly caused by the state of your body in the previous second, and you just follow the chain, and you will show that you are the same person since yesterday and since you were born. But I think like this is definitely a view that you will find, at least in philosophy, that a lot of philosophers defend, but you can usually tell that that's because of kind of like an intuitive understanding, and then they try to grasp at straws to figure out like why this could be true. And you have a lot of philosophers who kind of have actually given it up and have other views, because this is not tenable. One, maybe just to summarize like kind of like the core argument against it, it would be that for any what we call a identity carrier, that is to say like the necessary and sufficient condition that makes you over time within closed individualism, for any identity carrier that you may choose, you can always find counterexamples. So let's say that you think that you are your memories. Like memories is an identity carrier. Well, there's all of these things that you can do, like take a retrograde amnesia drug, where basically you forget the information that you learned in the last day or so that the next time you wake up, the closest you can actually tie in your memory, your identity in terms of memory, is the one day before. So there's like a whole section that you experience, but you can't remember. And then the question comes up of like whether you are that range of set of experiences, whether you were there or not. And at least in that case, the problem is that if identity holds transitivity, you have the effect that the person who was whose memories is going to be lost was the same person as the person before, and you are the same person as the person before that happened. So by transitivity, you are the person whose memories you don't share, and therefore it's impossible that memories are the reason for identity. So
what are the other potential carriers of personal identity?
So causality is one, metaphysical soul is another one. There's some people say things such as like how other people perceive you, which, I mean, to me, that sounds like very disconnected from ground truth, or like from what fundamental identity.
Sounds like a nightmare, having your identity being socially mediated.
Yeah, metaphysical identity being socially mediated. Yeah. Yes. What else? I think I think those are like the main ones. I'm sure there's like a few other ones I have written somewhere, but
So
yeah.
mainstream religious examples that are closed, that subscribe to closed individualism.
I mean, Christianity for sure, Judaism, Islam, and to some extent depends on the variant. Hinduism. There are like some branches of Hinduism that do consider each soul to be distinct from God, although maybe similar in nature. It's on some level, but still different identity.
Or variations on the theme of being individualistic emanations of the same, ground field, but with, different graduations of, how much significance they give those distinctions of the individual.
Right. A whole gradient.
The karmic thing.
Of the Brahman.
Brahman, yeah. All right. So that's closed individualism. Summed up, you start existing when you're born, you stop existing when you die, or you go to some afterlife heaven thing, and that's basically it.
Yes.
Next up, we have empty individualism.
Right. So empty individualism is the view that you are just one time slice, and it's it's scientifically consistent and also philosophically self-consistent. That's like definitely a very strong aspect of it, but it's very counterintuitive for sure, because intuitively you feel that you go from one moment to the next and you continue on some level being the same entity, at least on the level that matters. I mean, like, you make plans for the future, you care about whether you're going to be chopped up tomorrow or not, or like whether you're, you care about your future self often much more than you care about other people for evolutionary reasons. Again, that makes a lot of sense. But in empty individualism, you're not even like a different entity you were yesterday. You're a different entity than you were like 100 milliseconds ago. And actually, like, depending on and this is where like it interfaces with other aspects of philosophy, like depending on your account of how long a moment of experience lasts, it will tell you that maybe you exist for 100 milliseconds, or maybe for 10 to the minus 13 seconds, or even shorter periods of time. And again, like something crazy about this is that it also would tell you that the feeling of passage of time, it's all wrapped up within a single moment of experience, which is crazy. But once you take kind of like an inclusive or expansive view of qualia, like what qualia can be, like the feeling of time passing is also an aspect of your experience. It's also a quail, and it's super weird, but it could definitely be part of one single moment. More so, we also know from psychedelics and other currently corner cases of human experience that perception of time can be very different than it usually is. You can even experience moments of eternity where time doesn't seem to pass, or even weird things that seem like closed time-like curves where there's no beginning or end to it, and very weird things that can happen with time. So empty individualism would say, like all of those are just different states of consciousness, but none of that implies that you're actually moving in time as an entity. Like, all of that perception is just an interpretation that is happening in the present moment right now. And I mean, this definitely has a lot of appeal because it doesn't postulate the existence of a metaphysical soul. It doesn't make the strange it doesn't lead to the strange conclusion that you can be at two places at once. It does have some important questions to answer, such as, like, what is the boundary of an experience? Like, what makes an experience? What aspects or energy or computations within reality conform a single experience rather than belonging to a different experience? Like, why is the left and right side of your visual field part of the same experience, but maybe not my visual field and your visual field? I mean, that is like a very important question in empty individualism. But overall, I would say, it's a pretty consistent, pretty defensible point of view.
And if we were to give a mainstream religious example?
Right. Typically, people associated with Buddhism, I think like after I wrote an article about it, somebody posted some quotes from the Buddha that kind of indicates that he really wasn't empty individualist. And I think it's like maybe it depends on the branch of Buddhism, but a lot of Buddhists do think in a way that is very empty individualistic, in the sense of like, don't even think that you're gonna continue to exist from moment to moment. That's also part of what causes you to suffer and so on. Although, yeah, they might be more interested in whether the belief of identity continuing over time causes you attachment, and maybe it's kind of a more pragmatic view rather than metaphysical. But still, I would say, yeah, Buddhism maybe is the closest to it.
I chatted about personal identity, these three things, with Daniel Ingram. I think you are familiar with his work.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We had a really good chat a few
Awesome.
episodes ago. Yeah. And
awesome. I should listen to it. Yeah.
it's a good 3 hours. But yeah, he really liked empty individualism. He said that was basically bang on from a Buddhist perspective.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Good to know.
Yeah.
Do you think that he was looking at it from a pragmatic perspective, or he was quite philosophically committed to empty individualism?
The latter, I think. Perhaps both, but I think more the latter. So the last of the three is open individualism.
Yes, so this is the view that there's only one consciousness. And I mean, it does come with some, additional components, because it requires that identity can coexist among different moments and places. Or something weirder, which is that it makes you reconsider whether actually our conception of differences between moments and spaces is actually what it seems to be. So it would basically reframe how we partition things, how we break down reality, and it would make us reconsider it, make us maybe think that the fact that we think that reality has all of these different experiences is an illusion somehow, and there's actually just one very large experience and one very large observer, so to speak. And I think if you take seriously the idea that you do continue to exist from one moment to the next, like if you buy into that intuition, I think open individualism is pretty defensible after you do that, because you just combine basically the arguments against closed individualism together with a commitment with the idea that you do continue to exist from moment to moment. And then you realize that, hey, if from one moment to the next, maybe my memories have been jumbled up, but I'm still the same observer, then actually it's not memories that determine whether I'm the same observer or not. It must be something else. And if you go through all of the possible identity carriers, what you actually end up having at the very end is just consciousness itself. Like, the only reason why you continue to be the same entity from one moment to the next is because you're consciousness. And if you arrive at that point, then you would have to conclude that you are every moment of experience, whether it's in another person or another animal or what have you. But then again, I think sorry.
Oh, do you believe that this runs into problems of causality?
I don't think so.
What about if you're talking about observers in different light cones?
Right. Well, I think this view would also dissociate identity from causality completely. So it might tell you something like, well, what's causal about consciousness is the qualia values. I mean, like the fact that I experience certain colors and shapes and urges, and it makes me move. Okay, that has a causal property, but identity itself would be acausal because everything is the same identity. And
I think you had a quote from Alan Watts that summed it up nicely.
Which one is it?
It was something along the lines of everybody is God, wearing different masks and playing hide and seek with itself, or something.
Right. He definitely has that in one of his books.
Yeah.
But can you play hide and seek with someone in a different light cone to yourself?
Right. Yeah. So there is one physical view that I think would be compatible. I mean, definitely the light cone issue may come into play if you associate identity with, for example, energy itself. And John Wheeler and Richard Feynman once had a telephone conversation where Wheeler was basically trying to explain some aspect of Feynman diagrams where it would show that an electron can basically combine with a positron, which is like an antimatter electron, and form a very high frequency photon. But then mathematically, an electron looks exactly the same as a positron going backwards in time.
Yes.
And this was like very, very puzzling. And Wheeler came with the idea that, hey, maybe actually there's only one electron and is going backwards and forwards in time, knitting together the whole of reality. This is called the one electron theory. And then, I mean, you can also extrapolate it to like protons and quarks and, I mean, just different configurations of quantum fields oscillating and whatnot, but it's all the exact same thing. And I mean, definitely in this view, you would have to, figure out how to account for light cones, separate light cones also being the same identity. But I mean, that definitely would be a problem potentially with this view.
I have another sort of a leading question for you. If maybe something like open individualism was more widely accepted, do you think that would have the potential for generating moral claims over the autonomy of others, because like we might be considered to be the same identity?
Most definitely, yes. And I think that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, especially if you kind of take seriously the idea that there are differences in amount of knowledge and wisdom. You may share the same identity, but there's like gradients of wisdom nevertheless. So and the same. So I mean, a kid who is playing with a fire and gasoline, I mean, they may be very convinced that what they're doing is good, but I mean, as an adult, okay, like you do know better, as a matter of fact.
The word that comes into my mind is auto-paternalism. That seems to be what you get.
Yes.
Parenting yourself.
That's right. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it could go bad potentially, but I do suspect there will be an element of that into any very good society. I mean, really understanding, like, hey, like, if there's some group of entities that are producing a lot of suffering to themselves or others, and you know exactly what they're going through and why they're thinking in that way, because you actually have a good theory of consciousness, okay, then it might be good to act in their benefit.
This might help us achieve sort of a truly enlightened view of maybe that kind of paternalistic mode of action, as opposed to a not so enlightened view.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I suppose it would be scary, and it's definitely something that rings alarm bells because of, it could be exploited by totalitarian regimes and be used as a justification. But it could also be the real deal. So
yeah.
In these three concepts of closed, empty, and open individualism, are they all mutually exclusive?
I don't know. I mean, that is a good question. I tend to think, I mean, if you have a classical logic account of reality, they are mutually exclusive. But I've also heard some Buddhist interpretations that, hey, reality is neither open individualism nor empty. It's a weird middle point, and I like that. I mean, I wrote in one of my articles, the article about Burning Man, actually, where I kind of came to the conclusion that for good mental health, at least in humans, I think it's good to be kind of agnostic between empty and open individualism, and maybe closed as well, because really just buying completely into any one of them, at least in me, and I'm sure in some other people too, don't work out very well. So they tend to have side effects if you just completely believe in in any one of them. Yeah. I mean, like, sorry.
I greatly enjoyed that article, by the way. Your thrilling conversation with God.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, Daniel. I also spoke with about this with Daniel Ingram, and he said he basically, if I'm getting it correctly, he basically said that empty individualism is the truth, but it makes sense to approach reality in sort of a modal manner. So in certain ways, if you're driving your car, it's probably best to approach reality as if it's closed individualism, because if you approach it as a time slice, or that you are all consciousness, you will almost certainly crash and die. When you're in certain types of meditation practice, you should approach it as an empty individualist, and that you are only every tiny momentary piece of experience as it arises and passes away. And then in some other, perhaps wisdom and kindness sort of meditation or other practices, it's good to, bend towards open individualism. So maybe it's somewhere, wherever you direct your will, perhaps that's where you fall in that moment.
That's right. And one thing I've argued in Ontological Qualia, the article, was that indeed these different views have different functionalities, just as you said, and you pragmatically you can use them for computational purposes and just like to actually be more effective at different things. I mean, which has also the strange implication that if you look forwards in evolutionary terms, there might be what I call personal identity wars, in the sense of a group of large group of humans who they're all open individualists, may be very motivated to cooperate with each other to try to create kind of a global open individualist takeover. Whereas
hive mind,
yeah,
the hive mind thing. Sure.
Yes. So, and then like closed individualists may be motivated to cooperate with each other in order to prevent that from happening. So, and then like empty individualists would have their own motivations, which depends on some other subtle matter. So, I mean, it's unclear which one would win, but I think like there's like some tension, and definitely some people may choose the pragmatic view of not believing in any of them except for the purpose of being more effective, which, maybe they will have the ultimate advantage.
What one do you lean towards? Are you convinced of any of the above?
I have a stronger probability mass assigned to open individualism, and then empty. And I think closed individualism is very unlikely, although I haven't discarded the possibility. I just don't see how to really justify it. So, but I understand its intuitive appeal, and I haven't discarded it completely. But I think like open individualism is very defensible, and also for pragmatic reasons, I think it's good to approach reality as if open individualism is true, even though it has some scary consequences too. Yeah.
Next up in our list of topics is consciousness itself. So we have the important theory of consciousness, which is why consciousness feels good or bad, or the Valence issue, versus the hard problem, which is why consciousness exists to begin with. Perhaps we could unpack those a little bit.
Yeah, so the hard problem of consciousness, that's the idea that even when you account for all of the information processing in terms of form and function that the brain performs, there's still something left to account, which is why consciousness itself is present, and like what is that property. I already mentioned that I think the reason why we're conscious is because binding, basically the unity of consciousness, which is also called phenomenal binding. And I think in the end, these will actually almost solve the hard problem of consciousness, because it's gonna show that actually some intrinsic property of consciousness, its capacity for unity, and that's not something that would be possible without consciousness. Now, explaining why that might actually solve the hard problem, it's a lot harder, and it involves also discussing panpsychism, which we could get into maybe afterwards. But for a lot of philosophers, the hard problem of consciousness is just insoluble. They may say like it's just actually beyond our capacity to say anything about it. But I do consider it a very legitimate scientific problem, scientific and philosophical problem that will have eventually a solution. Now, We also have the important problem of consciousness. I think Mike Johnson, my colleague from Qualia Research Institute, I think he actually defines the important problem of consciousness as whether Qualia formalism is true or not. And Qualia formalism has to do with whether there is a mathematical object that maps into the properties of consciousness. And the reason why that's the important problem of consciousness is that if it's true, then consciousness actually belongs to the realm of science, and we can actually derive a formal theory of it. And if it's not, then consciousness will end up being something like élan vital, like the life force that we thought was like a real thing, but turns out there's just a lot of very complex molecular interactions, and that accounts for life. But we think, yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, this seems to be like one of the unifying themes of, I guess, all of the work of the Qualia Research Institute and Qualia Computing, the sort of notion of Qualia realism, as opposed to, I guess, people dissolving it or otherwise treating it as not real. To me, the analogy seems like relatively straightforward in, scientific methodological terms to the like wave function realism in quantum physics. You're more or less taking the position that just as there is one true thing, which is like the unitary wave function, and everything else is just its great mystical dance, most of your work seems to proceed, at least from the position that Qualia realism might very well be true.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. And we are of the position that if Qualia realism is true, that's not just a philosophical fun fact, but things follow from that. And in the end, if you can make precise empirically testable predictions using starting off from a philosophical background assumption, then you can actually surprise the opponents or the enemies of the theory and make predictions that really confuse them, especially really confuse them if they turn out to be true. And that's our take. That it's not only about consciousness being real and formalizable, but also that philosophical assumption will have real world implications, and we actually aim to prove that.
What are philosophical zombies? We chatted to Robin Hanson a while back, and he didn't seem bothered at all that it's possible that we could all be pea zombies.
Right.
Do you think it's likely that everybody is a pea zombie? Like, actually, first, what is a philosophical zombie? And then, do you think it's likely everybody is a philosophical zombie?
Right. Philosophical zombie is, an entity that is identical physically to a person, or potentially also to an animal, or some entity with consciousness, but doesn't actually have consciousness. And the idea is that it would be impossible for us to actually prove that it exists, that it doesn't have consciousness. Every test that we run would show identical results as the test that is performed with somebody with consciousness. Now, I don't think people are philosophical zombies. I suspect, like Robin Hanson would think that the question itself is nonsensical, because consciousness is really just, from his point of view, and at least like from the kind of like the group mind to which he belongs, would be that consciousness is identical with the information processing that goes on in a person's brain. So, to ask whether a person is conscious is no more absurd than to ask whether like a calculator calculated. It's like, okay, yes, a calculator it definitely adds and subtracts and multiplies. So like, what are you asking?
So in that view, the consciousness just supervenes on the biological activity, and I guess in your terminology has no causal efficacy. So in your paradigm, there would be no possibility of P zombies because of the efficacy of the consciousness preventing the external behavior from being visibly identical between like a P zombie and a real person.
Yes, that is correct. There would be tests that you could run that would determine whether some entity is conscious or not.
A good example of this would be when we finally engineer AI to the point where it passes the Turing test. So the Turing test, like a very, very, very strict modern Turing test. For those that aren't familiar, the Turing test is a test developed by a man named Alan Turing in 1950, and it's a test of a machine's ability to exhibit intelligent behavior equivalent to or indistinguishable from that of a human. Now, the problem with that is, in the future, we might create an AI that, in all ways that we can test it and in all of our interactions, it is indistinguishable from a human. But we wouldn't have any way to know truly if it was conscious, if the lights really were on behind those eyes.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think a non-conscious entity could definitely pass a Turing test. I mean, that I'm pretty sure of. But a Turing test is not, the best test of consciousness that there is. There's definitely better ones. I mean, to start off, although this becomes more science fiction, but I think it's physically possible. You could actually mind meld with the other entity. Basically, connect your thalamus with that other entity's thalamus with an actual physical neurological bridge in such a way that both brains contribute to the same experience. I mean, just as the binding problem is solved between the left and right hemisphere in your brain by connecting to the thalamus, potentially connecting your thalamus to the other person's thalamus may allow you to mind meld with them. So you would become one unified experience. You would be one experience that shares two brains, and you would basically have two visual fields and two body sensation fields and access to memories from two different people. It would be extremely bizarre. But yeah, I mean, if you do connect with a person and that happens, okay, like I would say that's a very strong evidence that the person was actually conscious to begin with. And there's like some refinements on that actually I think would become like very solid tests of consciousness. Which, yeah, I could go more into detail, but they're like a little bit hard to explain. Maybe better to read them.
Sure. Where would we read up more on that?
Oh yeah, so I wrote an article called Beyond Turing.
Oh, cool. Perfect.
Yeah.
All right, let's write it down. Beyond Turing. I'll chuck that in the show notes as well.
Oh, excellent. Yes.
All right. The next subtopic here in consciousness is mainstream consciousness research. And this is a quote here.
Yes.
Thousands of scholarly philosophy papers and books have been written on consciousness in recent years by drug-naive academics. Psychedelic researchers worry that too many of them evoke Aristotelian scholasticism, whereas what we need is a post-Galilean experimental science of consciousness. Could you elaborate on this and what is meant by Aristotelian scholasticism and post-Galilean?
Right. Yes. So, I mean, Aristotelian scholasticism, the idea that you can, you just, write enough books and you think about things from first principles long enough and you will have the answer. And which is just not true, because running experiments usually tends to counter one's common sense and intuition. And in practice, a lot of philosophy of mind tends to be grounded on intuition disguised as like formal arguments and again, implicit background assumptions that are just never challenged because you never experience a counterexample. And yeah, like altered states of consciousness really show you that a lot of the things that people hold constant and believe to be necessary about consciousness are simply special cases of something much more general. And the degree to which actually it's much more general, it's unbelievable, like just completely unfathomable for the average person, and even the most experienced psychonaut, I bet. And one very stark example that I already touched upon a little bit is the perception of time. I mean, some very altered states of consciousness can produce extremely radically different perceptions of time. And not only in the sense of like time going faster or slower, but actually experiencing time stopping or the absence of time or closed time-like curves, and a lot of other weird stuff that shows you that, yeah, that like a time itself, as you represent it with your experience, is just a special case of something much larger. And the way in which this connects to Galileo is, his actual battle to have priests and the church actually look through a telescope and corroborate his own observations. But they would even respond that why would I need to see through a telescope if I already have the Bible that tells me the truth, right? So the same, I think it's why should I bother alter my consciousness if I already read Consciousness Explained by Daniel Dennett, or like I already know it's an illusion. I already know what it's actually for. But yeah, no, I think the truth is that you take pretty much any neuroscience or cognitive scientist or philosopher of mind and give them the right agent, and you will definitely make them reconsider some of their background assumptions.
Perhaps we need to move back to the era where psychedelic telescopes can be distributed via mail to researchers.
Right.
Yeah. You touched on time there, and I thought we could talk a little bit about time. I've got one definition of time from Wiki here is time is the indefinite continued progress of existence and events that occur in apparently irreversible succession from the past through the present to the future.
Yeah.
Terence McKenna believed that we knew nearly nothing about time. How do you feel about our current understanding of time and time perception?
Oh my gosh. I think it's very impoverished. Like time, physical time, I think it's much better understood now than it was before, definitely before Einstein. And in the sense of, I guess like a little bit of a vocabulary is, you have presentism. That's the view that only the current moment exists. The past and the future are, like constructs. They're not real, although they're like useful fictions for making predictions and surviving. Whereas you also have eternalism. And eternalism is the view that, the present is just as real as the past and the future in a very similar way as France. You guys are in New Zealand, I'm in California. But France is also real, right? France is also real, it's just in a different place. And they would argue that, the past is also real, it's just in a different time. It really works out as just another axis or direction. And
that's equivalent to like the block universe sort of theory of time. You're just, flat four-dimensional blob somewhere.
That is correct. Yeah. The block theory of time. That's a way of visualizing it, which basically lays out the temporal dimension as another spatial dimension, and shows you that everything is static in some sense. But even if that is true, then you still have the weird thing that every moment of experience contains the feeling of time passing, and I think that is compatible. Something that part of what I've been working out on is basically connecting the various different theories of in philosophy of identity, valence, time, and so on. So, if you recall, the three views of personal identity: closed, open, and empty individualism. You can basically have each of those in presentism, or each of those in eternalism. So actually, you end up having like 6 views when you intersect time and personal identity. And they paint a very different picture of what reality is. The view that David Pearce, for example, would take is empty individualism together with eternalism. So just reality, it just is. It's just like this huge block, and it's weirder than a block. Is that kind of like this, weird like fractal, quantum fractal in configuration space, because it also contains other timelines and everything that could have happened and so on. But everything is just fixed in the universal wave function of quantum mechanics, and every moment of experience is just stuck in time right there forever. I personally hate this view. I think it's
it's terrifying.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Well, I don't even think it's compatible with wave function realism, really. Certainly something like a many worlds interpretation.
The many worlds interpretation would be also part of this block. I mean, that's why it's this weird fractal wave in configuration space. It contains also branches where the Nazis won, and completely different alternate history. But also those are frozen in time and space, and in their own regions of the wave function. Now, yeah, I mean, what I really hate about this view is that it would mean that a moment of suffering, it's just there forever, like a dinosaur that is being eaten by a different dinosaur. It's just like over there, like in a very, very like far, but over there, like somewhere. And yeah, I mean, like that's not a very, I mean, that's a very pessimistic view, personally, I think, of reality. The one I would like it to be true would be open individualism together with presentism, because that actually would mean that, I mean, we're not going to die, and also we're soon to probably experience like some really awesome things. Like there's a lot of the future of the universe left, and we're about to probably create a paradise engineering and all sorts of cool stuff, and the bad stuff is behind us, but I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I think like several of these combinations are defensible.
The empty eternalist view does give David Pearce a very strong case for ethics, though.
Yes,
like a very powerful reason why we need to shape our ethics radically in a new direction.
Right, and also it tends to provide a strong intuition for why I care more about suffering than increasing pleasure, right? Because once an entity is in a state of suffering, it's there forever, and like there's no way of redeeming a bad experience. So better just prevent as many of those as possible.
Mm-hmm. What's your outlook for the future of consciousness research?
Wow, yeah. I mean, I think the way I see it really is we're at the edge of a precipice, and there's a completely enormous space in front of us whose magnitude we can't even fathom. I mean, I think it's about to explode. Psychedelic research, we're just kind of like tipping our toes in the ocean, and then just it's a massive body of water. I mean, I think that said, that it will take people to actually spark the revolution for it to happen effectively and ethically. By its very nature, I think consciousness research, at least for its first few decades or maybe even first century, will probably still be very confusing and very confused in terms of metaphysics and reality. I mean, you definitely do have a lot of people who actually study psychedelics scientifically. They also tend to have like very weird views about what psychedelics are and aren't, and those views get smuggled into their research, like computational theory of mind type research on psychedelics. Often, at least what I've seen, is very misleading. That said, I think like if everything goes right, even if not everything goes right on our end, but kind of like at least if the general idea of focusing on valence, basically reverse engineering what makes an experience blissful. I mean, we suspect that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in there. So early on in the process of consciousness research, I think there's going to be a very big breakthrough in understanding what creates a very pleasant experience. So maybe in a couple decades from now, we will be able to explore very alien states of consciousness, but we will be able to do so in a way that guarantees that anything that we experience is very blissful. And I think that's very, very, very critical, because I mean, nowadays there's always the risk of a bad trip. And I mean, the probability depends on the person, setting and whatnot, but especially when you go to like completely new territory, like combining substances or exploring peptides or even gene expression, there's going to be a lot of casualties who will go schizophrenic and terribly depressed or irreversibly damaged. But if we can guarantee that the experience is positive, and I think that that's going to be possible, you'll be able to experience completely different realities, but still make sure that they're going to be very, very good.
What's your opinion on John C. Lilly?
Oh yeah, so I mean, I think he was super smart. There's no question about it. He was also fairly methodical, except potentially towards the end of his life, specifically when ketamine entered the picture. I mean, by his own admission, as well as friends and other people who knew him, ketamine definitely did change him quite a lot, and not necessarily for the better. quite the contrary, most likely. But I mean, for most of his work, I'm a big fan. I mean, I like his books a lot. I think he was brilliant. His framework was probably the most advanced that you could have at the time. One of the things that and I guess for those who don't know very much about him, basically, he pioneered the use of sensory deprivation tanks. He did a lot of research with dolphins and dolphin intelligence and prosthetics, as well as brain research. I mean, he actually stimulated regions of brains of monkeys to see how they would react, and mapped out pleasure centers as well as pain centers and rage centers. I mean, together with other scientists, but he was part of the people who did that at the time, and later on used large doses of LSD on sensory deprivation tanks, and he had experiences that completely changed his metaphysics. That said, in his books, he always was explicit about the fact that he was agnostic. I mean, that everything that he would write is just guesses, educated guesses perhaps, but still guesses. If you take them at face value, they are very outlandish. I mean, he talks about a hierarchy of different entities controlling how reality unfolds. And yes, especially with high doses of LSD and ketamine, he says that he was able to get in contact with alien organizations, ECHO being one of them, the Earth Coincidence Control Office, that makes sure that coincidences happen. And the other one was Solid Intelligence Society or something like that, and that they were like competing for the future of humanity and some very weird stuff. And I think, I mean, honestly, it's kind of like one of those cases of, oh yeah, he was like way too smart for his own good. He didn't have the frameworks, even something like Less Wrong in 2009, kind of rationalism and a community of people of his caliber. I mean, I think he was very alone. Honestly, if you compare other psychonauts of the time, I mean, be like Ram Dass and Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg and other people, it's like, I think John Lilly was way smarter than any of them. So, I mean, in terms of like being able to develop frameworks and philosophize effectively. So, I mean, no wonder, like if you're the only person at that caliber in the 70s, okay, I definitely can forgive you for going off the rails.
Yes, I think we know some people who'd be very interested in talking to the people running the Coincidence Control Center.
Yes, definitely.
Sure.
He did say that there was going to be a war in the future between people who wanted AI to win and people who wanted nature to win. And I think we definitely know people in these camps on the rationalist community.
I don't suppose you've seen Alex Jones on the Joe Rogan podcast.
No.
he has some very interesting thoughts on the matter of basically, well, that form of future conflict.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, it's hell of a time.
Yeah, they gave him quite a bit of beer and a couple of joints and just let him rip. It's quite a, it's quite a podcast.
Awesome.
Yeah. So, do you know at what point would the cutoff point be for John Lilly where you'd be like, okay, from this year, take it, read it for fun, and before this, read it because it's really interesting and potentially relevant?
That's a good point. Maybe, I think it's between, I think like, so he wrote a book called The Center of the Cyclone, and I think he was still very fine then. But then by the time he wrote the dyadic cyclone, and then the scientist. I think he had gone off the rails.
Okay.
So yeah, there's definitely like I think it's like, I mean, ketamine for sure, that like did something. So one meditation that he came up with, that it's very useful, and he has it. I think he has it written several times, but the place where I remember it's in a book called The Center of the Cyclone. He talks about, in the province of the mind, that which you believe to be true either is true or becomes true, within certain limits to be found experimentally and experientially. And he kind of like repeats that over a lot of times and with different takes. And the whole idea is to condition your mind to realize that you have implicit background assumptions and that they are generating a very big chunk of your reality. And that a lot of the times you may feel trapped and you think that there's no way out, but actually you're constructing the walls. You're not even realizing it. And going into a psychedelic experience with that mindset drastically expands the kind of experiences that you can have. And I have found that to be extremely valuable. I mean, in that sense, I admire John Lilly quite a lot, and I think it's been very helpful for psychonautics, reading that material.
Yeah, that's powerful. How do we safeguard and protect our future pioneering psychonauts from, telepathic encounters in float tanks with dolphins?
Right. So there's actually a document I'm writing together with a colleague called Justin Shovlin about how to basically explore the mind safely. And there's quite a few good heuristics. Things such as don't try completely novel things if certain conditions aren't met, such as that there's like some indication that the effects are going to be gradual, that it's reversible, that ideally you would do it together with another person, and you have a person who isn't receiving the intervention as well, so that if one of the persons starts to develop psychotic symptoms, both of you like stop it at once. So basically you have like notes to compare. There's a lot of heuristics, and I think especially when it comes to a hedonic tone, I do suspect the biggest dangers, I mean, especially of things like psychedelics, much more than direct brain damage, is trauma from bad trips. And just guaranteeing that the valence is positive just cuts off just a huge percentage of the danger. I mean, obviously being in just like very safe environment, very predictable, with very concrete experiments at hand, they're not going to get out of control, and also safeguards. I mean, I'm not somebody who promotes euphoriant drugs because they, on the whole, the area under the curve is not very beneficial. But when you're dealing with something like psychedelics and altered states of consciousness, it's really important to be able to have something at hand that, if your valence starts to become very negative, you can reverse that.
Yeah. The blue pill.
Yeah, the blue pill. Exactly. Yeah. Always have the blue pill at hand. That's
Cool. You put out a post recently entitled Dominant Theories of Consciousness at the Science of Consciousness 2018. So Science of Consciousness was a consciousness conference that you attended this year.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got a bunch of different theories of consciousness that were presented there, and you ordered them in sort of the most dominant theories for that conference, and I thought we might better go into a few of those in detail.
That sounds right. Sounds good.
Cool. So first up we have entropic brain theory. I've summarized it slightly, tried my best to at least.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so entropic brain theory predicts that different brain states and dynamics operate physically in a way that could be placed on a scale of negentropy or entropy, which is can otherwise be said as order and chaos. They predict that these physical states map directly onto and describe the subjective differences between normal waking states and psychedelic states. It also describes the idea of criticality, which is a state in which brain dynamics and subsequent subject experience sit between order and chaos. It predicts that normal wakeful states in humans are close to criticality, but are subcritical, and that psychedelics can usher the brain closer to a state of criticality. Entropic brain theory also predicts that psychedelics interfere with entropy suppression brain mechanisms, which would normally sustain subcritical or sober brain dynamics, thus bringing the brain closer to criticality in the psychedelic state. So that's my slightly summarized version of that. Perhaps we could unpack it a bit more.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think a lot of people would be confused about like what criticality means in this case.
Sure.
I mean, I'll get a stab at defining it. So, I mean, basically, criticality is the state within a system where small perturbations can lead to very far and big changes. And usually they tend to show up in systems with lots of moving parts and interactions and a notion of energy. And I know this sounds like very, very abstract, but there's one concrete example I usually go to, which is the case of a mountain full of snow. If you measure how big the avalanches are, and you plot them, you will realize that there's a lot of very tiny avalanches and a few very large ones, and somewhat in the middle. And the large ones are like a lot larger than the small ones and the medium ones. And in statistics, this is usually described as a power law. Basically, you can plot them in a log-log scale, and you get a straight line approximately if you plot the frequency of each of these sizes. And one of the reasons why this happens is that any small avalanche basically pushes snow towards another place in the mountain where it accumulates. So over time, a lot of little avalanches actually set up the stage for very big avalanches to happen. And entropic brain theory would say something like, well, when you are kind of sleepy or asleep, that's kind of like having a mountain with very little snow. I mean, maybe there's like a tiny avalanche here and there, not very much happening. When you're awake, normal range of consciousness, you have, snow up to a point where you have the certain pattern where every once in a while you have a large avalanche, a large like insight or a strong emotion, but most of the time it's kind of just a whole lot of little ones. And then they might describe a psychedelic state as, there's like a storm and a lot of snow is falling, such that there's a very high rate of large avalanches all the time, and it's uncontrollable. Basically, there's not much of a kind of like self-limiting mechanism in place. So that's what they might call as a supercritical state or beyond criticality, whereas normal experience would have criticality. And I mean, the advantage of a critical system over a subcritical or supercritical is that it has a lot of memory. I mean, basically, it's kind of like a straddling between chaos and order, taking the best from both worlds. That said, supercritical states definitely have their place. I mean, if you're in a very negative local maxima, shaking things up a bit can actually put you in a much better state, can help you escape your local region.
That's such a great analogy. Thank you for that.
There's also a pretty good analogy from nuclear physics, depending on how much nuclear physics your audience knows. But, yeah.
So the prediction that psychedelics can usher the brain closer to a state of criticality would surely depend greatly on the dose, right?
Oh, definitely. And I suspect also they might say something along the lines of like the degree of criticality is different from person to person to begin with. So like for a person who has less criticality to begin with, a higher dose of a psychedelic might be needed for its peculiar effects to actually show.
Would something like flow state also could be a description?
I don't know. I mean, intuitively, yes, but I'll have to get back to you about that one.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Next up, we have connectome-specific harmonic wave theory. When we talk about connectome-specific harmonic waves, higher and lower frequencies, what exactly is being described? And what is the connectome?
Sure. So, I mean, the idea here is similar to how objects have like their own kind of like natural resonance, resonant modes. I mean, like the string of a guitar, for example, has like one big way in which it oscillates, but then it also has a series of harmonics, which is when you have like the standing wave that fits an integer number of times in the string. So you have the second harmonic, which is you have like 2 oscillations within the string, and you have the third one, which is 3 oscillations, and so on. And the sound of an instrument is determined by the precise proportion of the amplitude of each of these harmonics. So connectum harmonics is the idea that something like this is going on in the brain, but along the lines of neuronal tracks. And you can measure your neuronal tracks. Actually, you have 2 kinds. You have white matter tracks and you have gray matter. And it's very important to actually distinguish between them because the speed of propagation is different. Like white matter, the electromagnetic propagation in the brain is faster than in the gray matter. And you need that to actually model what kind of standing waves actually can exist in the brain.
Electromagnetic propagation is signals?
Yeah, I mean, in
like nerve pathways kind of?
In practice, it's it's like action potentials at a statistical level. I mean, it's like one action potential is like, hey, like a neuron decides to fire or not, but then at the macroscopic level, if you focus on a given region of the brain, it's kind of the percentage of neurons that are firing there. And if you look at the entire brain, then yes, like there's these bands of activation and inhibition of regions moving that collectively, all of these neurons together actually generate a electric gradient. So it ends up looking not that different than something like an electromagnet or something like that, where like you have a very fast pace moving electric gradient that is, causing this kind of like turbine or dynamo-like physical phenomena.
In that piece there, you talked about consonance, dissonance, and noise in waveforms in the brain.
Right.
And you have predictions on how different substances might affect or induce those frequencies. So I'm a musician, so I'll briefly describe consonance and dissonance, and I'll play a couple of notes on the keyboard, which will make it easier for people to understand. So
Awesome.
Yeah, consonance is when you have 2 notes, like a chord. So a single note sounds like this. I think you can hear this, but tell me if you can't. So it's just that's just a normal note. Consonance is like a chord or an interval. Sounds nice to our ears generally. Then you have dissonance, which is when 2 notes are closer together, and that can sound kind of jarring and not so nice, which is like this. And then you have noise, which is you can pretty easily think of static or white noise, and then you know what noise is, right?
Yeah, I may have a white noise machine. Let me grab it.
James's vape
I
pen
can
is
generate
quite
some noise. I can generate some white noise right here.
Oh yeah.
That's his vape pen.
Hey, that's pretty good.
Pretty close.
Pretty good. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I'll settle for that.
So that's consonance, dissonance, and noise. And in this connectome-specific harmonic wave theory, consonance, dissonance, and noise are expressed in waveforms or can be described in that way. And you have some predictions, or they have some predictions on how different substances might affect or induce those frequencies. So perhaps we could unpack that a bit.
Yeah. So, like the first, like why on earth would we think that, consonance, dissonance, noise matters for, why does it matter for like emotion? I mean, which is very related to your question, because like the very motivation of all of these is to figure out, hey, like how do you quantify bliss? How do you quantify suffering in brain states? Going beyond just measuring activity in pleasure centers or fear centers, which really might be kind of like just a side effect or a trigger of like the actual phenomena of pleasure and pain. And if you kind of take the theory that we call the symmetry theory of valence, which is the idea that the more symmetrical the mathematical object that encodes your experience is, the more pleasant your experience is, then harmony and consonance, it makes sense that in sound that would sound good because it ends up being the same as symmetry over time. So harmony and consonance, it's not a kind of like a separate weird thing to explain, but it would actually be just a straightforward expression of symmetry. except that it's just in the axis of time. But that's fine. I mean, it's symmetry nonetheless. Whereas dissonance is an expression of what we call anti-symmetry. Now, anti-symmetry is not the same as the absence of symmetry. Anti-symmetry is the coexistence of incompatible symmetries. Basically, symmetries that on their own they would feel really good, but together they're incompatible, so they generate a non-repeating pattern, at least a non-repeating pattern within the window of your attention, and that is unpleasant. Whereas noise is actually the absence of a discernible pattern. So it's neither symmetrical nor anti-symmetrical, which would explain why noise feels neutral. I mean, you can put a white noise machine and that puts you in a pretty neutral state of consciousness. If you were feeling very irritated, a white noise machine can be soothing and relaxing. We would think of it because basically it's like cutting down the highest dissonance you're experiencing. On the other hand, if you're very happy, a white noise machine actually, it's pretty negative because it's preventing the consonance from expressing itself as strongly as possible. And we think that actually this generalizes to all positive and negative experiences, that it's not just a corner case, like sound is not just this corner case, but that a headache, for example, is actually a kind of dissonance, except that it's dissonance between brain harmonics, and that feels uncomfortable. And that pain, also, like physical pain, ends up being some kind of dissonance, and even cognitive dissonance may literally be a kind of dissonance between harmonics. Oh, and I guess you asked me about drugs. Yeah, I mean, the main idea is that different drugs modify the neuroacoustics of your brain, basically favoring certain harmonics over others, so that, for example, opioids and alcohol and depressants, I should say like relaxants. I don't know why they call them depressants, because if you're irritated...
they're central nervous system depressants.
That's right. Central nervous system depressants can be pretty euphoric if you're irritated to begin with. And we think that a calming agent does is it basically increases low-frequency harmony, low-frequency consonants, whereas stimulants produce high-frequency consonants. So, like amphetamines or, I don't know, cocaine, they're pleasant in the high-frequency range. I mean, they produce a lot of tightly coordinated, kind of like clockwork, high-frequency activity that is very pleasant in that range. And then, I mean, of course, like they're complementary. People enjoy combining stimulants and opioids together. That would cause kind of like a more full spectrum kind of consonance. Of course, like it's ill-advised for many reasons, but hey, like, I mean, in Valence research, it's important to explain, like, why certain combinations are positive and some are negative. And psychedelics, on the other hand, they seem to actually just increase the amplitude of harmonics kind of all across the board. I mean, maybe more the high-frequency ones, and that's what the research of Selin Atasoy showed with LSD. But they also just increase the activity everywhere. So you could kind of summarize it as just more energy. There is more amplitude there's more power in the harmonics. And this is both good and bad, because it makes more intense consonance, but it also makes more intense dissonance. Like, that's why, a bad trip or like a lot of anxiety on a psychedelics can be much more intense than regular anxiety. And finally, kind of kind of what you might consider an anti-psychedelic is SSRIs, like classical antidepressants, or modern antidepressants, quote-unquote antidepressants, that basically we hypothesize work as adding white noise to all of your experiences. So if you're like super depressed or super have a lot of anxiety, taking an antidepressant can be good because it will be soothing, but the best that you can expect to feel is neutral. And that kind of sucks. And especially if you do feel good for a good bunch of the day, a good part of the day, an antidepressant is going to blunt that. And people describe that orgasms become blunted and music doesn't sound as good. And pretty much anything that used to feel good and was kind of a very harmonic, pleasant state is degraded. So there's like that kind of like unifies all of the weird side effects that SSRIs have into a very simple unified framework, which has, in my view, a lot of explanatory power.
Do you have any plans for research experiments in this?
Yes. I mean, the thing that we are trying to actually test, and I do think actually we will succeed, it's just, we have like a few good leads for these. Basically, actually computing the dissonance, consonance, and noise in different brain states using connective harmonics, while asking people to self-report their valence. And there's like many ways of going about doing this. The key, though, is going to be introducing people who ideally are in extremes. I mean, I know, like, ideally, ideally we would put people who are like on MDMA on a scan, because we predict that MDMA will produce a very powerful combination of consonant harmonics, and that's why it feels so good. But I would probably settle for people who are like meditators and can achieve high levels of loving kindness, because that also is very high consonance, and I think that would also show up in the scanner. And to get the other extreme, definitely people with depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. We predict that you will see a lot of dissonance among the harmonics for people in very negative states.
That's so fascinating. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with that.
Yes.
What theory of consciousness makes the most sense to you, and what are you most excited about?
So I kind of like big picture views of consciousness, I think. I describe my view is very much similar to David Pearce's view, which is panpsychism together with quantum coherence to bind. I realize this is an idiosyncratic view and definitely not very common in the scientific community. In fact, almost kind of a little bit of a scorned association of quantum mechanics and consciousness, and not for good reasons in the end, because there's a lot of trash that combines those two views. But so first of all,
Could you unpack them briefly? Panpsychism.
Panpsychism is the view that everything that exists is conscious. Again, like there's an implicit background assumptions here, which is, but what exists? In our view, what exists is actually moments of experience. That a given, let's say, electron is, it's not really a particle in the classical sense. It's actually an oscillation of quantum fields. And and it has a given amount of energy as well. And we think that what an electron is, fundamentally, it's actually a given qualia, a given kind of experience, maybe a speck of blue or a speck of a given scent. That we don't know at the time what it feels like to be an electron, but we suspect that there's an actual answer to it. And that said, it's pretty well known that panpsychism, it has like the nice thing is that it reduces the amount of things that you have to explain in reality. Without panpsychism, you have the question of why is there something rather than nothing, and then you also have the question of, how is this something producing consciousness? You have these two apparently insoluble questions, but with panpsychism you have only one. Why is there anything at all? Becomes the same question as what is consciousness, or why does consciousness exist? But there is a pretty big disadvantage. Not disadvantage, rather a remaining problem, which is how each of the atoms contribute their own individual consciousness to a unified experience that becomes your consciousness, right? Like it seems that you have a lot of information in your experience. Again, like a lot of color qualia, sound qualia, emotion, textures, so on. How is the brain putting them all together? The implication would seem to be that we would all be mind dust. Like there would just be a lot of like tiny experiences in a brain, but no unified moment of experience. And that's where you actually need a real glue, like something that does put together various pieces of information at once. And that, at least within panpsychism, which is a version of, you can say it's a version of physicalism, or if you trust the laws of physics, then you actually need to find out something in physics that has the property of putting together many pieces of information into a unified energetic system, or a unified region of the universal wave function. And the only thing that I'm aware of that can actually do that is quantum coherence. Basically, and empirically it does it. I mean, like you can have quantum coherent states and they behave as a unified object rather than just a classical ensemble of different particles.
So what do you think of the state of the art of, like, Ryan hasn't brought it up yet, but like the orchestrated objective reduction theories, that kind of thing? Do you think that they, or any such theory, has been able to successfully avoid, at least say in principle, the objections relating to the, quote unquote, hotness and wetness of the brain for sustaining coherent quantum states?
Right. Well, David Pearce has a take on it. Right, definitely orchestrated objective reduction, which is the theory of Penrose and Hameroff. They also have a take on it. In their case, they put a lot on what's called
the microtubules and the...
Right. They associate consciousness with microtubules. The oscillations of microtubules inside your neurons, which is basically the skeletons of neurons. But also they point out that like the reason why quantum effects are possible at those temporal scales is because of topological quantum shielding that the microtubules afford to the water molecules inside of the microtubules. So, and they claim that allows actually quantum coherence to exist for periods of maybe even milliseconds. I don't know. I'm agnostic. I'm kind of skeptical. David Pearce has a much more counterintuitive way of reconciling decoherence timescales, which, basically this is like how quickly quantum coherence tends to dissipate on hot environments. And the brain is pretty hot.
Yes.
So David Pearce instead bites the bullet and says, well, if a physical calculation shows that decoherence takes over a neuron in the span of 10 to the minus 13 seconds, then that just implies that a moment of experience actually lasts for maybe 10 to the minus 13 seconds. And
right.
And again,
that's the bullet he's chosen. That's the bullet he's chosen to bite, and thus constrain his conception of what the unified consciousness is, limited to, or
that's right.
Temporarily.
Right. Definitely that view hints much more towards empty individualism, for example. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Where a given moment of 1 second can contain maybe like thousands or maybe trillions of snapshots, and you're not the wiser because each of them contain the whole information of like an entire moment of experience. So you can't really notice how fast this thing is.
Maybe there's a question for future research if we manage to keep a brain running at cryogenic temperatures to see what kind of timescales we can sustain.
Right.
Just get it right down there, but somehow keep it running.
Hibernation.
Extend out those durations of coherence.
Yes, for sure. Definitely with quantum supercomputers that actually use maybe some architecture with that solves like microscopic binding. Yeah, if you were to cool them, this theory would predict that they would become super sentient. Just potentially like massive amount of consciousness. And the fact that you can have super sentience is definitely already proven with psychedelics. If you take 30 milligrams of DMT, you may not believe it, but I guarantee you will believe it while you're experiencing it, which is that you will probably have like about as like 20 times more amount of qualia than you have normally.
I believe that. I can definitely say that. That's an interesting observation because that's the sheer intensity of qualia available is something that I've noted.
Yes, this is definitely another reason why philosophers of mind should definitely explore with these kinds of agents, because computational theory of consciousness, for example, tends to emphasize a lot of maybe information content, but they struggle with the notion of intensity. Like, hey, you have two conscious experiences, they have the same information content, but one of them is like much more intense than the other. Like that's very odd, but it's totally possible. I mean, that's definitely realizable. Yeah.
In day-to-day life, I mean, we're familiar with what we consider to be regular and perhaps, slightly super elevated or somewhat elevated states of qualia intensity, and also we're quite familiar with somewhat apathetic states of, negligible intensity. But you've got to recalibrate that scale.
Exactly. Yes.
This is a good bridge into the topic of psychedelics, actually.
Sure.
The first subtopic within psychedelics here, which is related to this, is psychedelic states and the lowering the symmetry, detection, or propagation threshold.
Yes. Yeah. So, well, that's taken from basically what a framework that we developed called algorithmic reduction. So that's basically, I mean, nowadays when people describe a psychedelic, they usually make a lot of mistaken. They have like a mistaken philosophical approach to it, which is that they focus on the intentional content of the experience. It's like, oh, I experienced a huge alien clown in some kind of circus or whatnot, or like Terence McKenna's descriptions. I mean, they're like very focused on the intentional content. I mean, that is to say the aboutness of it. He's like, oh, I saw clowns, or I saw elves, or I saw a spaceship. But I think those are like details relative to describing the quality or the phenomenal character of a psychedelic. And I think because you can experience so many different stories and narratives with the same state of consciousness that like just telling you a narrative doesn't really tell me what it felt like. I mean, I could experience watching a spaceship and having aliens tell me secrets on ketamine and on DMT and on LSD and like, but there would be completely different experiences. I mean, like it's completely under constraints, the actual quality of it. That's definitely also something that John Lilly had a problem with. He focused too much on the intentional content, not enough on the quality of the experience.
Have you been making progress on sort of helping people systematize describing the actual changes in the qualia themselves?
No, unfortunately. I mean, I don't know of many people who have kind of like become better at describing their trips after trying to coach them, but I think that's coming. I mean, there's an article I haven't written, but I plan to write called "Wanted: Better Trip Reports." So basically, it would describe like things that are very helpful to talk about and things that are unhelpful, and provide examples of how to actually make progress on describing a particular state of consciousness and telling it apart from other states of consciousness. There's quite a lot of things have to do with, for example, describing frequencies. DMT. I mean, for a lot of people, this is kind of like an absurd or idle description, but I think this is spot on to say that DMT is a higher frequency psychedelic than LSD, for example. I mean, they both have a feeling of having higher frequency states. Again, that sounds absurd, but within the context of connectum harmonics, hey, that makes total sense. Like there's higher frequency harmonics, there's lower frequency harmonics. Psychedelics tend to preferentially activate higher frequency harmonics. We already know that thanks to the research of Selin Atasoy. And DMT seems to be activating even higher frequency harmonics than LSD. And given some estimates, the difference is something, LSD is 20 hertz, whereas DMT is 30 hertz. So kind of a bump up. And the algorithmic reductions, basically what they say is like, hey, don't focus on the intentional content. Focus instead on trying to provide as few basic effects as possible, such that when you combine them with each other, you get the full zoo of possible effects.
I'm looking forward to this sort of like increased vocabulary, so I'll hope that will be helpful.
Yes. I mean, I think there's going to be several iterations for sure up to like when we can actually have like a really good vocabulary. But right now there's a ton of low-hanging fruit for sure.
One of the dimensions that I would note, as well as say intensity of qualia, would also be perhaps I don't know if you've attempted to describe this, but the actual the actual degree of unification of the experience itself. Is that something which you describe in other places?
Yes, definitely. I mean, that relates to the symmetry detection thresholds very much. There is... Oh, and valence as well. Let me see how to start. So,
what is the symmetry detection threshold?
So you may notice on a lot of psychedelic depictions, I mean, obviously fractals are like super prevalent, but there's also tessellations. When people show like replications, you can also go to like Reddit/r/replications, which shows a lot of people trying to create pictures that represent what it feels like to take LSD or mushrooms and whatnot. And something that is common in these replications is, people call it as a symmetrical texture repetition. And that's when a given texture of grass or a carpet or the sky, it looks like there's a repeating pattern that fills up space, often in a plane, but it could also be 3D. And the common pictures that people show usually have a mirror symmetry. It's kind of overlaying several mirrors together and making a kaleidoscopic shape. But something that I investigated, and especially there's a anonymous psychonaut that has helped me quite a lot because he's read a lot of the articles and he sends me results of some experiments that he conducts. It's been found that not only kaleidoscopic symmetries are possible to experience, but actually the full range of all possible symmetries that are mathematically allowed are actually possible to experience as texture that repeats itself. And mathematically, there are only 17 possible symmetrical arrangements. They're called the 17 wallpaper groups. And John Conway, the same guy who invented the Conway game of life, these cellular automata that creates kind of artificial life type things, and he did a lot of work on basically systematizing these and finding very simple proofs that it's only 17 possible symmetries and how to generalize it to 3D.
Was that 17 possible symmetries in 2 dimensions?
In 2 dimensions, correct. When you go to 3 dimensions, you end up with 230, and I mean they kind of explode after that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what we found is that on psychedelics, any of those 17 symmetries is possible to experience. There's a couple other things to say about that, which is that it's always a progressive thing because they don't appear spontaneous. They don't appear all of them at once spontaneously. It's actually some kind of gradient ascent process where at first you have like a tiny little region of your visual field that has a symmetrical relationship, and that starts to copy itself out throughout the rest of the visual field. And also you have the phenomena of having lots of different incompatible symmetries. Sometimes it's like different regions of your visual field start to tessellate, but then when those tessellations meet at the edges, you realize that they can't actually coexist. But then what you can do is focus on them at the same time, and eventually your brain finds a solution, a way of putting them together in a way that is actually symmetrical and that preserves as much of the inherent symmetries of both. So if you meditate, I mean, the trick here is, one, stay calm, meditate while you're on a psychedelic and focus on these symmetries. And you can actually do quite a lot of interesting things with this. You can basically climb the symmetry gradient to the point where all of your experience becomes a massive tessellation. And what seems to happen is that when you achieve that, that's a profoundly intense and profoundly blissful experience. I suspect that most peak experiences, when people say I saw God or I merged with infinity, they're actually experiencing a supersymmetrical state, and they just don't have the vocabulary for it. But it's this feeling of there's no boundaries, everything is completely connected and perfectly visible and accessible from the same point of view. It's extremely blissful. It has all of these very quasi-religious qualities that in our framework really just is very high valence and very high intensity.
What do you think it means, the fact that all of these possible symmetries are in fact, at least by self-reporting, accessible, that we can actually exhaust them?
Yes, it's a huge discovery because it shows that we don't have just a few symmetries hard coded, but rather conscious states span the entire range of possible mathematical symmetries. I mean, that definitely constrains the possible mathematical objects in the sense of like, yeah, this is a very complicated object that has a very general range of possible expressions and projections. But to me, it also definitely goes against a little bit the neuron doctrine of neuroscience, which is that for any given object that you may represent, you have an individual neuron that represents it, and also that all you have to do to understand consciousness is figure out how different neurons encode features. Because there's also the problem of rendering, like how your brain renders the features that are being encoded. That's something that modern neuroscience doesn't think very much about, but these experiences of high symmetry shows that the rendering mechanism is fully general. Like it's not hard-coded what possible states it can have.
Explain, like I'm 12, the hyperbolic geometry of DMT experiences.
Yes. Right.
I think it's 12, right? It was.
Yeah.
It wasn't to explain like I'm 5. It was something.
Yeah. Right. That's a difficult. So I mean, the hyperbolic geometry of DMT experiences is maybe the article I'm the most proud of intellectually. I don't think it's the most urgent, ethically. There's other more important ones I've written, but just in terms of like how much thought I had to put in to make sense of DMT and reduce it and transform it from something completely inscrutable into something that actually makes sense mathematically. I'm pretty proud of of that article, but it's pretty long and hard to understand, and that's why I ended up actually writing explaining it like I'm 12.
It's also very useful to see the images, I think.
That's right. Yeah.
So maybe we'll just put a note there for people that are interested in DMT or have tried DMT and are interested in the crazy sort of dimensions that you end up in that place. Check out that article, The Hyperbolic Geometry of DMT Experiences. I'll put it in the show notes anyway, but that's fascinating to read through.
Yeah. So I guess like the simplest thing to say is that you can tell. So if you're in 2 dimensions, a Euclidean space, and you want to cover the plane with a repeating shape, you can choose a triangle, you can choose a square, and you can choose a hexagon. And that is like all of the ways in which you can tile a 2-dimensional space, Euclidean 2-dimensional space, completely. But what if, and classical psychedelics, again, if you look at a patch of grass or a carpet or whatnot, you'll see a bunch of symmetries that are Euclidean. I mean, you can decompose it into squares and triangles and hexagons just repeating over. And but what if you see something else that is also covering the entire plane, but it's not a hexagon, triangle, or square, but what if you see a heptagon? But the space is not distorted, it's still completely covered and you can see it very clearly. Okay, so like if that is happening, you're not actually seeing a Euclidean space, you're seeing a hyperbolic space. Because in a hyperbolic space, you actually can have basically what amounts to more than 360 degrees within a circle. It actually doesn't work exactly that way, but that's a kind of good way of describing it in the sense of heptagons. Three corners of a heptagon actually makes more than a circle, but that's fine in hyperbolic space. You can totally fit that in. And hyperbolic space has also the property that if you start from one point and you kind of create a circle using a radius, that the area of your circle as a function of the radius will grow exponentially. Whereas, or it's actually a hyperbolic cosine, but hyperbolic sine, but it approximates some exponential growth extremely well. Whereas in Euclidean space, it's also always a polynomial. Like in 2 dimensions, it's the square of the radius or proportional to it. And what the psychonaut that I was talking about reported, and we went quite a big back and forth on these, making sure that it was true with further experiments, was that on DMT, a lot of the symmetries you experience are hyperbolic symmetries. You can see heptagons tessellating the plane. you can see even the higher shapes like octagons and polygons of 9 sides and it,
Nonagons.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's crazy that they can still make a tessellated plane. And the plane, its shape, I mean, its subjective quality changes completely. Also, the very resonant modes of those spaces. I mean, in higher doses, it's not even just planes that do that, but also 3D space becomes hyperbolic, which is why people end up saying like, oh, I went to a space that was more real than normal space. And it had like a different quality to it, and like it seemed bigger in a smaller region. And I posted in the article kind of 17 reasons why DMT actually involves hyperbolic geometry. I mean, all of them are kind of like little pieces of evidence that together, I think, build a pretty solid case so that DMT involves hyperbolic geometry quite a lot.
Do you envision in the future, when all of these drugs are made legal for research purposes, some sort of a training institute where you could train psychonauts to not only recognize all these different geometric shapes and patterns and tessellations, but also retain their memory and not get freaked out and not go down the route of John Lilly?
Absolutely. There's this is a term I got from David Pierce. I really like this. I wrote an article about it called the Super Shulgin Academy. So Alexander Shulgin is this very awesome psychonaut. Yeah, for the people who haven't heard of him, he was the person who synthesized for the first time a lot of pretty cool and fairly safe drugs, such as like 2CB and 2CI. That, I mean, basically they produce both very pleasant states like MDMA together with psychedelia like LSD, but without the neurotoxicity and a bunch of like very useful compounds for research. He ended up like producing like 200 new compounds. I mean, maybe about like 10 of them are actually super useful. The rest are like maybe more like odd, but worth having for basic science. And then the other thing too is that Alexander Shulgin, I mean, he would try these compounds on himself, but he would be very rigorous about doing so. I mean, he would start off with like 1,000th of the smallest possible dose that could conceivably have any effect whatsoever, and build up how much he would take of a given compound very slowly, like maybe double it every time until he felt a hint of it, and then maybe add 30% the next time, and so on, 30 in amounts of 30% until he felt a good level, and then he would stop. And it's incredible because, I mean, he tried probably like 300, 400 different substances that he synthesized over his life, many times over, all of them. And he didn't go crazy, he didn't develop any serious health problems, and died when he was about to be 90 years old. So in terms of rock solid, extreme psychological robustness, I think Alexander Shulgin is a very good person to look up to. And a Super Shulgin Academy would involve like thousands of full-time paid researchers who are actually conducting rational and sensible experiments like that, but in a full-time job.
That's so cool. I'll have to look into Shulgin a bit more.
Oh, there was a great Slate Psychotics review of his book. That's probably the introduction I'd recommend.
Yeah.
I'll chuck that in the notes as well.
He published a few books, but yeah, the most famous one is Pikal and Tikal. The first one is called Phenethylamines I Have Known and Loved, and the second one is Tryptamines I Have Loved and Known and Loved, and but yeah, tryptamines and phenethylamines are kind of the two biggest class of psychedelics. But I'm sure this is just again like scratching the surface.
Do you have any experience and or thoughts on Iboga or Ibogaine?
I have no experience with Iboga, but I am extremely interested in it. Honestly, I mean, its psychedelic effects, I'm sure, are very interesting and useful, but that's not my main interest in Ibogaine. My main interest in Ibogaine is its capacity to apparently reverse opioid tolerance, which, I mean, from the point of view of reducing suffering, that's a huge deal. I mean, I wouldn't advocate my grandma take Ibogaine to make the pain meds work again, but But I do think a foundational research on how ibogaine reverses opioid tolerance would be really important, because if we can generate a compound that hopefully doesn't produce mind alteration but reverses opioid tolerance, I mean, that would be a massive amount of suffering reduction by, basically allowing people who have chronic pain to literally just never have to worry about it. The pain medicines are just going to work flawlessly. I think that would be huge improvement. Plus, this is a very dark, very dark joke, but I'll say it anyway. Plus, it would, basically make all the junkies overdose and end their miserable existence. I think
we can sort of do a reasonable approximation with low dose naltrexone if you've looked into that. It seems that we're probably significantly underutilizing that in terms of like co-usage with opioids.
That's one of the very sad. I mean, that's hands down, like super high priority EA cause area, effective altruism cause area. If you ask me, would be do more research on reducing things like opioid tolerance, because again, like massive benefits for pain and treating addiction and a bunch of other stuff. But yeah, like naltrexone.
We could already be compounding it with most opioid prescriptions, and it would probably be effective even without
It would. I think my impression is that something like a ultra low dose naltrexone can probably help the problem maybe like 30%. But I think it's kind of like something that makes the problem less bad. But to my knowledge, doesn't actually. It just softens the tolerance. I don't think it gets rid of it. But yeah, there's other compounds that are very promising as well, and maybe a combination of all of them. Maybe just for the sake of they're interested. Other promising ones is agmatine, which is an amino acid that seems to reduce opioid tolerance to some extent. Then also proglumide was used in the 60s to treat ulcers, and is no longer used because it's less effective than new things. But it also had the effect of reversing opioid tolerance. And of course, ibogaine, which, as far as I know, is the one that works the best in the sense of a person who is like a heavy opioid user. If they take, what I heard at the psychedelic science conference in Oakland, 2017, was that giving microdoses of ibogaine for a period of 2 weeks, followed by a full dose, almost completely reverses opioid tolerance. So I don't think naltrexone does anything
not that drastic,
as powerful as that. Yeah, not that drastic. The effect size is on a different level, I think.
From what I've read, have you read Daniel Pinchbeck's book Breaking Open the Head?
No.
One of the chapters in there is his harrowing experience with iboga, with a tribe in Africa. Yeah, it's very, very interesting 3-day journey where he describes being able to access his memories in such a way that his consciousness became sort of a computer screen, even with the mouse pointer, and he could just open up folders of his memories as a child and open them up and watch them as a third-person observer. That was the positive part of the experience, but it sounded sounds pretty intense. Do you know? Are you aware of any other novel or less known psychedelics?
Right. Well, I don't know if novel per se. I know like 4-HOMET seems to be pretty interesting and promising for producing very similar quality as MDMA. Well, actually, like a mixture of MDMA and mushrooms without apparently like serotonergic damage. So it would be kind of the equivalent of a 2CB on the tryptamine side. Tryptamines is a compound similar to mushrooms and DMT, whereas phenethylamines is a compound similar to mescaline. And 2CB is a phenethylamine. It produces empathogenic, so MDMA-like states together with psychedelic states. And then tryptamines produce like very, usually more deep psychedelia. Phenethylamines tend to be, I mean, they can also be very deep, but they're like less powerful usually. But the 4-HO-MET seems to be super promising because it's kind of like a empathogenic and also a tryptamine. So also might be a really good one for exploring psychedelia with a lower probability of a bad trip.
And less neurotoxicity as well?
But yeah, I think so. I mean, there's no indication of serotonergic damage, which, I mean, again, the state of the research is very, very, very poor. We need much better research, but yeah, I mean, it's a lead at the very least. The other one is MET itself without the 4-HO. Apparently also it's kind of like a very pleasant state with no come down, which, yeah, I mean, that sounds very interesting. I haven't tried it, but with kind of like no tolerance. That was the other very interesting thing about it. Like DMT is kind of interesting in tryptamine space because it doesn't have tolerance. Like if you take mushrooms today, tomorrow, if you take mushrooms again, you'll feel almost nothing. I mean, mushrooms have a massive tolerance. But DMT, you can vaporize DMT today and tomorrow, and it's going to be pretty much the same both times. And MET also seems to be that way. Like it produces a very pleasant, somewhat psychedelic state, and you can take it every day, and it doesn't produce tolerance too. So that's, yeah, to me, super, super promising, super interesting to look into.
So we're getting closer to paradise engineering already.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. I mean, the holy grail would be something that is like almost like MDMA, but with no tolerance, no neurotoxicity, and no come down. That's that would be the crown achievement of psychonautics.
Absolutely. Engineering paradise. Let's talk about the hedonistic imperative and David Pearce.
Yeah.
I think I'll just leave it with a quote from the Dalai Lama in 2005. It proceeds, "If it was possible to become free of negative emotions by a riskless implementation of an electrode without impairing intelligence and the critical mind, I would be the first patient." Earlier we talked about valence and reverse engineering valence. So let's talk about valence engineering.
Yes.
How you think valence engineering will actually eventuate, and why you think it's a good thing as well.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I think first of all, yeah, like how is it gonna look like? It really depends on like what valence ends up being. If something along the lines of the symmetry theory of valence actually works out, and let's say like in the year 2050 or something, you feel depressed and you don't know why. So like you might go to your psychiatrist or your doctor, and you might say like, "Hey, I'm suffering from these symptoms." Rather than giving a kind of a hammer type approach, which is giving you like SSRIs or SNRIs, like serotonin or norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, that in our framework basically just work as a noise added into the system, they will be doing something much more customized. They would basically put you in a brain scan to figure out what are the main causes of dissonance in your state of consciousness. Like what are like the main things that are causing you to experience distress? And the answer might actually look like, hey, the 17th and 19th harmonics are interfering with each other a lot, creating dissonance. So let me prescribe you, let's say, coloracetam, like this very obscure nootropic that if you take it, most people, when they take it, they will feel pretty much nothing. I mean, maybe some very subtle effect that is like neither good nor bad, just kind of just a small change. But if you take it, the effect is going to be profoundly positive because it's going to, let's say, diminish the activity of the 17th harmonic so that it's chirurgically, like very specifically, getting rid of one of the components of the dissonance that is making you irritated or in a negative state. So I think it's going to look like something like that we will really understand, like at a deep level, what is causing the negative states of your experience and how to most efficiently getting rid of them. Now, the question of like, well, is this good? I mean, there's definitely the question of like, hey, like to what extent states of suffering or states of dissonance Are they helpful for some reason? Obviously, you have the case of if you're in a bad life circumstance, maybe it's good that you feel dissonance about it, because if you're getting screwed, you better do something about it. And sure, I think that there's a good case for that, but that's usually a very tiny percentage of the suffering that exists out there. I mean, a very large percentage of the problems don't seem to be tractable to the environment whatsoever. It's like, hey, I feel depressed and pretty terrible, even though I have a good job and a good relationship with my wife and I have kids and everything. Like, there shouldn't really be a problem, but you still feel pretty bad. It's something biological, something that having to do with your very particular idiosyncratic brain states. In which case, it's just pointless, unnecessary suffering. And I would even say that, I mean, even in the first case, when you're in a bad circumstance, I think you could still just like shift the hedonic tone or the valence or quality of your experience upwards while still maintaining the gradient. So that, hey, maybe you're not suffering intensely, but you still realize that changing your circumstance would make you feel better. And like sometimes like that's all you need. You don't need to, in addition, feel really bad. You only need to have like the gradient that if it was different, it would be better.
Because that's where the information is contained.
Exactly. The information is contained in the gradient much more than in the absolute values. So up to a point. I mean, if you push it far enough, there's some information intrinsic to positive and some to negative, but I think that's like a tiny percentage of the functionality of the valence ranges.
How do you feel about the emotion of boredom?
Yes. So sometimes I say boredom is extremely interesting. And it really is, because boredom is, I think people dismiss it as a worthy study, object of study very, very quickly. And it really isn't. I mean, there's a lot of tricky aspects about boredom. And more so, I think like boredom, at least the functional aspect of it, is very... I was about to sneeze, but it didn't happen. So boredom is very interesting, because I actually think boredom is essential, or the functional analog of boredom at least is essential for intelligence. When you're learning something new, getting bored at the right time is really important. If you get bored too quickly, you get demotivated and you never learn to the fullest some new content. You get bored too fast and you don't actually learn. But if you never get bored, you get stuck in local maxima. You just continue going over and over and over to the same simple patterns that you saw already, and you never actually build new connections or create new thoughts. So I actually think like a very defining characteristic of intelligence is that highly intelligent people tend to get bored at the right time. Basically, their boredom mechanism, as we call it, gets activated when you're hitting diminishing returns on the subject that you're learning, so that you actually continue learning new and more exciting things over time. But I do think that nowadays, with the most common scenarios, that people's boredom mechanism is overactive. People get bored too easily, and that is unpleasant, and it just doesn't benefit anybody.
So, from a hedonistic imperative point of view, boredom would perhaps remain, but would be sort of pushed to the most efficient place that it could be.
Yes. Or we could find a functional analog of boredom, so that you have like a blissful boredom of some sort.
Right. Yeah, great.
The other thing about boredom is that we think it's implemented with dissonance. That actually, when you learn a pattern, let's say a song that you've heard a lot of times, at first it was very exciting because you were discovering new symmetries and patterns in it. In fact, we think whenever you detect a pattern, that's pleasant because it's actually instantiating a symmetry in your experience, finding relationships between the various aspects of a song, for example. And over time, they are there, but they are not instantiated. So the symmetries could be in the input, but you don't feel them anymore. And boredom is what makes that happen. It basically kind of adds this additional dissonance that prevents you from fully experiencing the patterns again. So we think that the fact that you stop enjoying music is not intrinsic to music, is this added mechanism that we have on top of how we process music, and you can disable it. I mean, like, very straightforwardly, we think psychedelics are kind of like very much an anti-boredom. Like they completely obliterate the boredom mechanism, and everything feels new again. Like a song you have listened to like 1,000 times, like sounds like listening to it for the first time. And that, I mean, that doesn't mean the experience is going to be good. It just means it's not going to be boring.
That's true. We have here slow euphoria, fast euphoria, and spiritual euphoria.
This was something that I I really enjoyed reading about in your sort of valence engineering concepts, the ability to create by using multiple sort of somewhat mutually exclusive brain states that feed in and out of each other to create metastable patterns of valence that allow you to exist in high mood, high valence states for extended periods of time by using that variation. So I thought that was a great concept. I'm wondering what you're doing with it these days.
Oh yeah, that's right. Thank you. No, I mean, I think it's a good intuition pump. Mostly, at least at this point, because most people think of. People for the most part, for pretty much any new idea, they usually think of just strawmans, right? It's like, oh well, this can't work because, and usually something pretty dumb, and. In the case of paradise engineering, a very common reply is like, well, if you felt blissed out all the time, then everything would be uniform, and like, what's the point of a uniform like world? But that's a huge misconception, because the range of experiences that are positive is also extraordinarily large. Like, there is different varieties of bliss that are as different as like color is to sound, except that it's in emotion space. But they're both equally valuable and extremely important from an ethical standpoint. And so I think like in the future, what I call wireheading done right is that it's not going to be something like, oh, you always feel excited or you always feel relaxed, which, I mean, don't get me wrong, I think that would be good, except that it wouldn't be very useful. To actually be competitive in kind of like a future economy, I also call it like the economy of states of consciousness, where basically you buy and sell information about states of consciousness. You actually need a way of keeping yourself motivated to explore consciousness or develop new information or develop new math and so on. So to do so, the best way is to actually change periodically from one positive state to another positive state that have different functionalities. So there might be some states of consciousness. In the original article, I just mentioned 3, which is like fast euphoria, slow euphoria, spiritual euphoria, which, I mean, roughly correspond to the happiness that you feel from stimulants or exercise, and then that's fast euphoria. The slow euphoria is the happiness from opioids or from relaxing, massages and so on. And psychedelia kind of produce the philosophical or spiritual euphoria, which as we talked about earlier, has a lot of super criticality. So it actually it's really useful for creativity, and is really useful for producing new information. So
as well as using these multiple modes to, say, remain motivated and still be like a functional human being, it also seems to help very much with the constraints that we're still operating on biologically in terms of the feedback loops that tend to resist persistent, changes in hedonic tone. And so this may very well be like a key strategy in combating that.
You're absolutely right.
The antidote to the classic, what goes up must come down.
That's right. But yeah, I mean, I think it can definitely be taken much further, like where you're balancing, the original thought is kind of throughout a day, like in the morning you feel super motivated, like like methamphetamine, something pretty extreme, but like really energized.
Yeah, this is New Zealand, so we smoke meth for breakfast. And,
Right. Then like afternoon is kind of psychedelic, high creativity. Like in the morning you get the exploitation. Like you get all the executive things out, the things that are boring and tedious, but you have to do. It makes that pleasant. Then in the afternoon you feel highly creative. Maybe not very functional. I mean, extreme creativity and hyperphilosophia and psychedelic states are not, very functional, but they produce a lot of novel information. So they were like good for innovating. And then in the afternoon or like at night, you go into very deep relaxation, like opioid high or something like that, but healthy and sustainable. And then you repeat over. But because every day you're acting on the knowledge and you're producing new knowledge and you're resting, you could potentially maintain it forever. You could take this much further and go to the kind of like sub-second emotional transitions and think of, there's like some qualia varieties that are really good at criticality. So maybe you experience that for 100 microseconds and for 100 milliseconds, and then you shift towards a different kind of bliss and then a different one, and you can stitch them together to produce computations. I mean, that's when it gets like, Qualia computing gets like really interesting, when you can like modulate affective and emotional states at the sub-second level. I think, then things like a super intelligence are going to seem much more plausible when we can do that.
Widespread adoption of SSRIs is potentially a signal that people are interested in improving their hedonic baseline. How far do you think this extends currently, and do you think it would change and perhaps become more widespread in the future?
I mean, I think it's definitely one of those kind of cultural revolutions where the pendulum swings in one side and then swings in the other. Definitely, when the antidepressants came into the light, it's like, oh, wow, like you can have something that works sustainably, doesn't have the major side effects of euphoriant drugs, and people got like super enchanted with it. I mean, you can see the advertisements in the early 90s about Prozac in television and in magazines, and they seem like this is the wonder drug. And I mean, and no doubt for people who are severely depressed, who never experience joy, SSRI can be a huge relief. But yeah, that's a pretty small percentage of the population. But I think like right now it's more kind of the pendulum swung on the other side. Is like, well, so many people are taking SSRIs that actually the side effects tend to be more of an issue than the benefit for a big chunk of the users. So it's actually a net negative for a lot of people. And people notice that. And right now, I think there's a lot of skepticism, right, on SSRIs. But when we come out with MDMA that you could take every week without neurotoxicity and without a calm down, or at least not a significant calm down, I think people will listen. I don't think, there's going to be some resistance, but I don't think there's going to be a very strong resistance or for very long. Honestly, I think nature will take its course. People will share their stories, and it's going to propagate pretty strongly and pretty fast. I also think it's going to be like a ridiculous economy about it. Like the first team of people and researchers who produce something like MDMA but sustainable, you could do every week, not even every day, just every week. It's going to be like multi-trillionaire. So there's a lot of economic forces that are going to be pushing for that. Yeah.
Certainly, I could see the personal productivity angle coming into play. There'll be a lot of people in Silicon Valley, etc., who will want to be doing this just to, maintain their hedonic tone for optimal productivity.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And also, the whole cognitive enhancing economy is cognitive enhancement economy is huge. Starting from Adderall, amphetamines, and methylphenidate and modafinil. That are essentially very powerful nootropics of a certain kind. Branded as like focusing agents or stimulants, but used as nootropics and cognitive enhancers most of the time. Massive economy, and then of course like all the nootropic companies and so on. And the thing that is not very much discussed is just how powerful the role of hedonic tone and mood is on productivity. Like, of course, like amphetamines help people concentrate, and sure, that's part of the reason why they're effective. Maybe not area under the curve, but while they're actually useful in their acute effects. But I think actually the bulk reason why modafinil or amphetamines actually help people is because it puts them in the right mood where they actually enjoy doing otherwise tedious things. And when it comes down to modulating enjoyment, that itself is going to be like a massive productivity, a source of productivity, like unbelievably much more so than like marginal improvements in your working memory or episodic memory, or all the other things that things like piracetam do, that like matter, but not nearly as much as actual enjoyment or motivation.
What consciousness technologies are around today that excite you aside from drugs?
Yeah, well, obviously, optogenetics to me. For those who don't know, this is the use of gene editing for the purpose of getting neurons to express photosensitive receptors, so that you can control activity of neurons using light. You can excite neurons or inhibit neurons, and you can inject viruses that basically make these infect these neurons, but not to take over them, but make them express these genes. You're gonna make that very targeted to specific regions of the brain. So, I mean, for example, like treating intractable depression, optogenetics apply to the pleasure centers. I think that's pretty straightforward. There's definitely a lot of papers of optogenetics on the VTA, which is one of the regions of the brain, that ventral tegmental area, that feed into the pleasure centers, and it seems to be a way of almost immediately reversing symptoms of depression, and without producing tolerance. So that's like, wow, like, okay, this is we're onto something really big when it comes to optogenetics, and it's like, it's not a drug, it's actually modulating your brain activity with light, which is kind of crazy. But
how does that work exactly? They inject this virus that changes the expression of genes in the neuron, and then do they fire a specific frequency of light at the person?
Exactly. They start expressing rhodopsin, I believe, which is like a photosensitive receptor. I mean, that it works similarly to how a neurotransmitter, like a ligand, like something that responds to neurotransmitters works, except that rather than, like, let's say, like getting activated with dopamine, it gets activated with red light, or light with 400 nanometers or 600 nanometers, or specific frequencies. So
how do you get that into the brain?
Usually through a needle. I mean, so I mean, that's actually kind of the biggest hurdle right now doing human studies. Is like, it's pretty invasive to.
Maybe you can shine a laser pointer up your nose and.
Yeah. I mean, and rodents, it's insane. But and I actually saw this happen in a laboratory. I took a class at Stanford to see how it happens. They literally open up a little hole in their cranium, inject them with the virus in there, in some specific region of the brain, and then, rather than sealing the hole, they put a fiber optic cable, and then they put some plaster, or like cement, something that solidifies and sticks to the bone, and then they put stitch together the skin on top of that. So basically, there's like a big, relatively huge fiber optic cable, like directly shining light into the brain.
Fiber optic trepanation. That's the.
Oh, okay. Yes, that summarizes pretty well.
Oh, I mean, just as a sort of a jokey, like, that's what you would call it.
Yes, fiber optic trepanation. Yes,
neotrepanation.
Neotrepanation. Yes, which I mean, I don't know how to port that into humans and make it socially acceptable, but I mean, I'm sure somebody will come up with a way to do it in a less invasive way, or at least in a way that feels less invasive, even if it's more, as long as it's safe. I don't care.
I'm sure some of the more extreme branches of the transhumanist community would love to give it a crack.
Yes, definitely.
Some of the grinders. Yeah.
And I mean, Amanda Fieldman and a few other psychonauts in the 60s had the weird belief that the brain was too big for our cranium, and actually they would drill holes into their cranium, and with the thought of like becoming more creative. I mean, it's kind of like you
opening their mind.
Literally, exactly, literally.
So there is precedent.
Exactly.
And of course, all the Neolithic trepanation and everything like that.
Right. So, yeah, I mean,
any other technologies that are exciting you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very into transcranial magnetic stimulation. The main reason, I mean, we just need a higher frequency. I haven't found like anybody selling TMS hardware where you can modulate frequency at the hertz level in ranges of up to like 100 hertz, which is like what we actually need for testing some of our the symmetry theory of valence. But TMS, I think like when it gets like more miniaturized and localized, which I think is just an engineering challenge, that's gonna allow us to explore consciousness like very much as well, like modulating brain harmonics with external magnetic fields. I mean, there's already like some things like these, like the God Helmet by Dr. Persinger. Again, like they claim that was kind of a sham because they tried to replicate the studies, but I thought Persinger's response to that, I guess, yeah, for those who don't know it, this is a helmet you can put on, and it puts a very high frequency shifting electromagnetic fields in your temporal lobe, simulating the activity of something akin to a temporal lobe epilepsy. And in maybe 40% of people, that produces extremely religious experiences.
We've actually talked about the God helmet on a previous podcast. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, right, but and that is kind of like a hammer. Like, I mean, there's like a hammer level approach, like, but with a much better hardware that actually encompasses your whole brain. I mean, you can think of it as kind of like a very well-fitting cap or hat with lots of electrodes, but with really good hardware and like feedback with EEG. I think that's going to be able to modulate brain harmonics pretty well.
It sounds like a really good engineering challenge. Like I'm an electrical engineer by trade, so that sounds very
awesome.
Intriguing.
Yeah, we can hire you.
Boom.
Just some high bandwidth, high power amplifiers and but it's the computational problem that would be challenging, how to actually coordinate all of the multiple electromagnets to produce the right fields in the right locations. It's big.
Yeah, that's right.
Big computational electromagnetics problem.
Yes, and the feedback, like how to adaptively change it in response to the EEG measures.
Sounds like a collab.
Yeah.
Is in order.
Yeah.
Have you tried anything like the Lucia number 3 light or the Anya light? Have you heard of those?
No, can you elaborate on that?
I don't know what one preceded the other, but they're these lamps with 12 or so LED lights in them that flash at different frequencies. You also wear headphones, and the people that have invented them have some sort of sophisticated software, and everyone that's tried it says it pretty much simulates or replicates low-level DMT experiences. One of my friends who I trust has tried one, and she said that she had visuals and saw flower people and everything simply with a light. And yeah,
sure.
But they're very expensive. The people that have invented them are quite out there, and there's a lot of woo sort of new age stuff surrounding it. So I was hoping that you'd know about it or would have tried it. Dennis McKenna went on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he was talking about one of them and was testifying to its efficacy. So,
right, yeah. So I mean, I do know about a brain entrainment more broadly, which seems like this is a special case of it. And Anil K. Seth, which is a cognitive scientist who has presented at the Science of Consciousness, and he recently conducted a study of giving people, strobe lights of high frequency, and then asking them to fill out a questionnaire of altered states of consciousness, and he found that it actually seemed to be a similar pattern to psilocybin, but a lower power. I mean, it's kind of like the pattern of like, how much visuals and how spiritual and how embodying and all of these different dimensions. It was similar to psilocybin. Very different to ketamine. I mean, that's important to point out. Like, it's like putting a strobes and getting brain entrainment that way gets you a kind of psychedelic state, but not a kind of dissociative state, which is, okay, that's interesting information. Like, psychedelic states have some strobe-like properties, unlike dissociatives, even though they're both, again, completely different from normal experience. And but that to me makes perfect sense. I mean, it is completely in line with the symmetry theory of valence, because you're basically selecting for fewer harmonics and adding power into them. So of course you would have like more consonance and more dissonance, more intense emotion, which is one of the things they describe. And in addition, psychedelics do this thing that's called control interruption, which is that they inhibit the activity of the cortex, which itself is an inhibitory system, inhibitory signals, serotonergic signals to the thalamus. So it's preventing the thalamus from being inhibited, which in practice results in, hey, like the inhibition fails every, let's say 10 times per second. So that translates into like a 10 hertz strobe. So yeah, neurologically, it's I think like there's a lot of overlap in there. And one more thing about this is that the brain EEG signature of orgasms also seems similar to the signatures of strobes and brain entrainment that way. So again, that's to me, that's more evidence for the symmetry theory of valence. Is like, hey, orgasms are really good, they're really pleasant, but then they're like this very simple pattern, and most people tend to intuitively like, oh no, like the highest pleasures are like intellectual and very sophisticated and high information, but hey, like an orgasm is pretty simple neurologically, but it's very good.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. Hey, we're nearing the end here. Just really quick fire question here. Binaural beats,
Yes.
Are they in brain entrainment or nonsense?
No, they're brain entrainment through a different method, which is I would call them like indirect brain entrainment, because what you're getting entrained with is the beat pattern of the two frequencies. But yeah, similar principle. I mean, yeah, I haven't personally found them very enjoyable.
No, neither.
Yeah.
No.
Stroke.
And I couldn't find any literature on binaural beats at all.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I haven't
yeah.
looked too far. I mean, I just haven't found them very useful personally. It's just like the effect size is not that great.
No.
But strobes, I have tried like strobe lights, and I think they're useful. One additional thing is that combining brain entrainment and psychedelics have a very strong synergistic effect. It might be important to be cautious, because may give you seizures. Anecdotally, some people have had seizures that way, but yeah, I mean, if you're on 3 hits of acid and they put you a strobe light at 10 hertz or 15 hertz, you're going to feel like you're on 7 hits of acid.
Right.
So.
Good way to maximize your time. All right, we've got a few ending questions here. These are just sort of a nice way to tie up the podcast. So,
Sure.
First one is a book, film, TV series that most significantly changed the way you saw the world.
Oh, gosh.
Give me more than one if you want.
Sure. I mean, I guess if the hedonistic imperative is a book in some sense, but I mean, let's say kind of like things that are like fiction. I would say Philip K. Dick has been pretty influential. I loved Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is in my opinion, like a lot deeper than Blade Runner, which was based on it, because they also have this thing called the Penfield Mood Organ, which is a device that basically allows you to experience any state of consciousness you want, especially any mood. And I had thought of it before, but like never in such concrete terms. And I think like that's kind of like a really good objective to look for. Like, let's build a Penfield mood organ. Okay, now we have a concept handle for talking about that thing. I mean, I usually talk about it as kind of like a dashboard of consciousness, like a keyboard that has all of these different moods and combinations that you can make by typing and programming them. I mean, this is a lot more silly, but honestly, something that did influence a lot how I would see the world when I was a kid was Back to the Future. I was obsessed with time travel, and I think like that's I mean, in the end, it's like very very similar in the space of like, hey, like really thinking through how like a self-consistent theory of causality can work out. I think that gave me a lot of good intuition pumps for later work. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like in the space of fiction. I mean, I think like a lot of books by Philip K. Dick. I found them tremendously very very good and worth following.
Great. Second, if you had right now $10 billion to throw at any one tech development, what would it be and why?
Right. I mean, it would be to develop a Penfield motor again. Tying it back to the previous, yeah. But I mean, I think, yeah, because like transhumanism. I like the way of describing transhumanism as having three main objectives: the so-called three S's of transhumanism, which is super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness. There's like a ton of transhumanists who are like into super intelligence. That's the most common one, I think. And next is like a super longevity. And there's there's people who care about it, but the percentage is very small. Maybe I would say like 10% who are into the super happiness. I'm in favor of the three, of course, but for me the urgent one is super happiness. So yeah, I mean, pushing a couple $1 billion in that direction, I think would be tremendously good.
Mm-hmm. It's probably the most neglected out of them.
Yeah.
Sure, and it would improve the developments of the other two, no doubt.
Yeah, and one more word about it is that, honestly, I think kind of talking about Robin Hanson, I think, why are people not more interested in super happiness? I do think it has to do with signaling, because showing that you care about happiness kind of signals that you are a little bit of a weakling, in the sense of like, oh, you can't take the full load of life and reality and be stoic. Yeah, I mean, I think that's if you take away kind of the social signaling component. Oh, and the other thing is also virtue. I mean, it's kind of you signal virtue by saying that you don't go for the baser pleasures. You go for the very highly intellectual pleasures and so on. And kind of like hacking your reward function is really ugly from that point of view.
Yeah, hedonism as a term is usually a negative term.
Exactly, very derogatory even. Yeah. Well, of course, there's like the hedonism philosophical view and hedonism, but yeah, hedonism is a lack of self-control, and they tend to get mixed up, unfortunately.
Yeah. If you could have your body cryonically frozen and maintained at death for free, but you don't know who your friends and family, if any, would also freeze themselves and survive, and you don't know when or if you would be revived, would you do it? And why?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's fine. Like, I guess I'm kind of unconventional in that sense. Like, I mean, personally, I care a lot about the well-being of my family and friends, but I mean, the fact that they wouldn't be in the future, I don't think that's a good reason to not be in the future. That's I don't know. That's weird. That's also virtue signaling of some extreme form.
That came up with Robin Hanson as well. There was a sort of a publicized disagreement between like him and his wife.
Oh, really?
She was concerned that just about the fact that he would so readily basically submit himself to be teleported into the future through cryonics, even if he thought that they wouldn't be there.
Right.
It came up in some interviews and things. I think they've worked it out eventually.
Shit.
That's fascinating. Airing out weird transhumanist disagreements.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I mean, again, like, if you take open individualism seriously, it's like, why do you care about cryonics, right? But I think it is good, because, I mean, right now, like, a very large percentage of human suffering is because of aging, to begin with, and then the death of people you love. I mean, that's a very big deal. Like, I think like part of our responsibility as transhumanists or like forward-looking people, it's to get rid of death, and that would be a huge weight lifted off our shoulders. And I think there's setting up a good example. It's good. I know that David Pierce is actually he signed up for cryosthesia, which is actually a combination of euthanasia and cryonics, where as soon as you're
much more effective, I think.
Yes, exactly, because as soon as you die, even if it's just like 2 hours or 3 hours, I mean, like, you obviously know that, like, if you don't get oxygen for like 5 minutes or more, there's like irreversible neuronal damage, right? Like, now imagine being dead, like it's a tremendous amount of damage from that. So that plus the fact that if you already had like Alzheimer's or dementia or Parkinson's, and there's like a lot of neurodegeneration in the process of aging itself, so that cryosthesia is like, hey, like if you start to feel symptoms of Alzheimer's, like don't wait until that information is lost. Just preserve it as is.
Well, I think we're about out of time. We better let you have your Saturday evening, the rest of it, what's left of it anyway. How can people find you and your work?
Right. I mean, I think qualiacomputing.com. I believe you guys will put a link to it. I mean, another one is definitely through opentheory.net, which is the blog of my collaborator, Mike Johnson. We like what he writes in there. I mean, obviously he's writing it, but it's very much the fruits of our work, as well as Qualia Computing is the fruits of our collective work, and David Pierce as advisor is really not just me. Oh, and also anonymous psychonauts who, have helped me with data collection.
The unsung heroes.
Yeah, the unsung heroes. Yes, and but I mean, one thing I'm always interested in is like one announcement is like we just got actually the number for being able to accept donations as a nonprofit, and it's tax deductible. So I'll give it to you guys so that you can also share it. But I mean, we're happy to receive donations. This year and the next year we're gonna start scaling up Qualia Research Institute and probably get on with some internships as well as some like paid work potentially. So we might actually be able to have like some funding for like for a 3-month internship and get people to actually collaborate with us on writing papers and publishing them and developing the technology. So, yeah.
I hope you have some crypto deposit addresses in that donation page as well, considering what happened with maps.
Yes, definitely. We will do that.
Fantastic. Andres, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, man, and keep up the incredible work.
Thank you so much. I mean, you guys are really excellent interviewers. You were on top of all of this stuff.
Yeah, we're big fans.
We're big fans.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, man.
Huge thanks.
Awesome. Have a wonderful evening. I mean, wonderful afternoon.
It's evening. It's evening now.
Yeah. Oh, excellent.
It was the afternoon.
Yeah.
You too, man. All right.
Ciao, ciao.
Take care. Bye.